Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing story. What if Deku was a necromancer? This amazing story was written by Magnus9284. Please support them. Don't forget to like, sub, and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. A sinister injustice. The Siriidii institution, Japan's quietly, and internationally, ranked center for the social readaptation of the dysfunctional, was famously known for being willing to adapt to the needs of its patients and their families. Visitation was an encouraged affair, and all meetings were eagerly scheduled in whatever area was available that would fit the patient, their quirk, and the level of care said patient needed. The facilities for visitations were as numerous as the patients themselves. There were lofty balconies, home-style chambers that didn't look like dungeon cells, rooms divided by military-grade ballistic glass, and even public seating in the institution's own gardens. And those were only the more popular options. So it was understandable to the informed that Mitsuki Bakugo would be shocked to find that she was allowed to visit her son in the Siriidii's mess hall. "So, you've been doing alright?" Mitsuki asked hesitantly, the blonde woman doing her best to keep her fluctuating mood under control. The distraught mother was still feeling uncharacteristically off-kilter, but she was still able to notice that while her son appeared more mellow than normal, his crimson eyes hadn't lost any of the aggressive passion she'd probably had more than her fair share of instilling in him. At least, better than expected? Mitsuki was under no illusions regarding the situation, and no amount of reports or assurances from her son's doctors or therapists would fool her. She knew her son. Her brat might have avoided screwing up this long, but any close scrutiny would cause him to explode. "Oi! What the fuck's that supposed to mean?" Katsuki hissed, just barely managing not to scream. The bomber's rage was contained, but only just. "I had a shitty start, yeah, but I'm telling you now I'm gonna pass this goddamn test." A large man that could have easily passed for a shaved gorilla, standing innocuously off to the side behind the explosive blonde, snorted in bemusement. Mitsuki remembered the orderly vividly. He was one of the faces of her nightmares, the one that had taken her son away on that harrowing day so long ago. "Oh, shut it, Bokamona!" Katsuki snapped, twisting in his seat to bark at the living mountain of muscle. Mitsuki tensed, but the easy smile on the orderly's face told the worried mother that her son's outburst was neither impactful nor worrisome. Her brat turned back to her, a pensive look crossing the scowl he normally wore. "So, any good news?" The ashen mother forced herself not to flinch. "Yes," Mitsuki said, digging into her purse to pull out a handful of sheets. She handed the shackles of ink and paper to her son. Well, sort of. It had been its own special kind of hell, but Mitsuki had finally been able to meet face-to-face with her old friend Inko. The normally combative mother had tried calling the homely greenette over and over again first. When that hadn't worked, she'd tried stalking her old friend from a distance, hoping against hope that she'd find the perfect moment to approach. Unfortunately, she discovered that the Azui household was built like a fortress, cameras covering every inch of a perimeter blocked off by a stone wall. And the streets, normally the best choice, hadn't been a safe option. Wherever Inko had gone, a gang of biker girls, of all things, had followed her. That hadn't worried Mitsuki at first. She'd been her own brand of delinquent back in the day, but those girls had been, especially unfriendly. Getting within 100 meters of her old friend had set the more aggressive of the protectors off something fierce. Then Inko had seemingly disappeared. Or at least, she'd thought Inko had disappeared. When she'd seen her old friend again, the plump woman had gone from her slightly haggard and out-of-shape physique and returned to how she'd looked before either of them had had children. The greenette was once again the knockout of her youth. At the end of her rope, Mitsuki had decided to make one last gamble. She'd literally stood outside the Midoriya apartment and waited until her old friend had returned home. And after 10 hours of agonizing, Inko and Izuku had walked up the stairs. If Mitsuki had thought the searching and waiting had been painful, then the resulting meeting had been a new sort of torture all of its own. Inko had turned out to no longer be the overly forgiving woman she'd once been. And Izuku, sweet, shy, standoffish Izuku, had shown the beginnings of an honest-to-God spine growing with his mannerisms. The Midoriya mother and son duo hadn't sugarcoated anything when they'd recounted Katsuki's litany of crimes, not that Mitsuki had believed she deserved such niceties anyway. The two had also reminded the ashen mother that the explosive blonde had already basically been forgiven by everyone in the past numerous times, forgiveness he honestly hadn't deserved. It had probably been one of the more painful pills to swallow, the truth that her brat had bullied Izuku for so long and so harshly, a burden the Verdunette had basically shouldered alone, while his ex-friend had basked in the light of their biased society. 3 hours into the meeting, the blonde bomber's final attempt to downright murder Inko's green-haired cinnamon roll of a son had not seemed like the straw that broke the camel's back, but the anvil. In the end, it had actually been Izuku himself, her brat's most aggrieved victim, who had asked the two mothers to work something out peacefully. Mitsuki had blessed the boy's overly heroic heart even as she'd stifled tears. I know it doesn't look fair, but there were no words to describe the situation they found themselves in. The agreement the Ashen mother had just handed over was the only means of saving her family. It was the best offer on the table. Oddly enough, explosive cursing and or ear-splitting screams of outrage did not immediately follow. Mitsuki blinked. Katsuki was reading the document, actually reading the fucking document. Page by page. I believe you. The words were spoken with an unbelievable softness, a tone Mitsuki hadn't heard from her son in ever. The uncharacteristic empathy threw the Ashen mother for a loop. What? And I doubt it was easy, Katsuki continued, still flipping through the agreement, bowing and scrapping to get anything from those fuckers. The orderly huffed at that, and Mitsuki just barely noticed the pause and long blink her brat took at the towering man's reaction before returning to his reading. If she didn't know better, the Ashen mother would have believed Katsuki had just been corrected for misbehaving. But that was bullshit. Nothing she'd ever done had ever been able to get her explosive son to behave. What could an institution do that a mother couldn't? And language aside, Katsuki hadn't been too far off. When Inko had finally agreed to another meeting, one without Izuku present, Mitsuki had felt like $1,000,000,000 yen. She'd written down the address of a certain coffee shop and happily left the Midoriya's apartment. That night had been the first peaceful sleep she'd gotten in weeks. The following morning, Mitsuki had felt the beginnings of an ulcer form when she'd entered the coffee shop and immediately been confronted with the stern gazes of Inko, Baru Azui, and Tensei Ida. The intimidating lawyers that the Ashen mother had confronted at UA, the ones that had mangled her soul the day they'd taken her son away, had seemed like harmless puppies compared to the combined might of the three family members of her brat's victims. It had been a slaughter. Flashback. A certain coffee. You can't be serious? We most certainly are Mrs. Bakugo. But it's just so. These are the only terms we will accept. A tense standoff had arisen between Mitsuki and the three representatives of her son's victims. The demands that had been made were stifling. And none of the three sitting across from the Ashen mother had seemed to have been moved by either her fiery words or impassioned pleas. Mitsuki had slumped in her seat then, ignoring for a moment the steely gazes pinning her down. The normally spitfire of a woman had turned her thoughts inward, hoping for the last time that she had overlooked something, anything that even hinted that there was a way her brat, as ungrateful as he had always been, still had a way to live his dream. For all his faults, and for all she acted so tough on him, Katsuki was still her baby boy. But as she'd sat there, stark reality had reasserted itself over the foolish spark of optimism Mitsuki had woken up with only that morning. 5 hours later, 5 hours of groveling, begging, and pleading later, this is where she'd ended up. She could either agree to a binding promise written in the blood of her son's future, or lose him forever. You know, Mrs. Bakugo, we only agreed to give you this offer because of Izuku, Karo, and my brother. The two were adamant that your son be given this one, final, chance. It's the only chance he has, Mitsuki. That had finally broken the last of Mitsuki's unbending spirit. She owed so much to Inko's boy. Flashback. Present, Siriidii Institution, Mess Hall. You just have to sign. Mitsuki said, swallowing her nerves. Salvation might have been at hand, but only if her volatile son chose it of his own free will. Katsuki nodded, flipping over the last page of the agreement. The explosive blonde put the document down and reclined back in his chair, arms crossed and eyes closed. Mitsuki was struck speechless again. Was her brat meditating? The Ashen mother took a deep breath, exhaling slowly to keep herself in check. If this was what her son had to do to calm down after reading the agreement, she just hoped he wasn't about to make the wrong choice out of spite. The agreement wasn't ideal in the least, and contained clauses and requirements out the ass to stay in effect. If Katsuki signed the document, he would not only be accepting a sealed expulsion from UA, for good, but also a 6-month stay at Siriidii for proper rehabilitation. He'd be waiving rights against constant monitoring and be willing to be tracked for up to 2 years by a third party. Less concerning, but still blows to the face, were the secondary points, such as agreeing to pay Ida's medical bills for the injuries his attack had caused and not objecting to a restraining order put into place regarding all 3 victims of said attack. Outside of official events and hero work, he wouldn't be allowed to even be in the same prefecture as any of them. And even in the face of all of that, it was still the best option that had been given, as the payoff was a dropping of all charges, and a single chance. The only alternative given was prison time and a lifelong ban from the path of heroes. If I do, Katsuki said, snapping Mitsuki from her troubled thoughts as dual crimson gazes locked, will I still be able to apply to other hero schools? Yes. The Ashen Mother nearly shouted, all too happy to answer, of course. There were no words for how thankful Mitsuki was for that clause to be added to the agreement. While it was painful to know that her son would never be able to achieve his dream of graduating from the best hero school in the world, at least he would still be able to be a hero. Honestly, the Ashen Mother shivered to even consider what her brat would have done if Inko hadn't worn that Azui bitch down on that point. At least Katsuki seemed to actually be considering the agreement now. Before I agree to this bullshit, I have a request, the explosive blonde growled, the ominous words stilling the hope that had been growing in Mitsuki's heart. Of course her brat would wait until the last minute to fuck everything up. Did they even have room to compromise? I want to take someone out of here with me. Mitsuki almost fell out of her chair. This damn brat was going to kill her one of these days. Hey legs! Get the fuck over here! Katsuki shouted, turning in place once again to snap at a corner that led to a hallway out of the mess hall. Stop hiding like a bee, stop hiding so the old hag can see you. She needs to know how fat your ass is so she can get an idea of how much to widen the doors of our house. It took a second, but from around the corner, Mitsuki could just make out the shape of what appeared to be a teenage girl peeking at them. Except, what kind of teenager had dimensions like the Sylvette's, but a height so disproportionate? The girl was hugging the wall, but while her torso and head appeared unquirked and what used to pass as normal, the placement put her at 3 meters tall. Then the girl began to move, and Mitsuki understood. First came the sounds, sharp chitinous blades clacking against the linoleum floor. Then, the girl's body came into view, a massive arachnid formed straight out of myth. The distance between the newcomer and the blonde duo, already small, shrank rapidly as spindly legs rapidly carried the arachnitor forward. As the Sylvette approached, and her human features came into focus, Mitsuki took in the girl's full appearance. Junko Kanno didn't know what to expect as she neared the expectant blondes. Sure, her roommate accepted her, but he was a barbarian and a vulgar oaf. Sure, he saw her as a girl, and that felt nice, but he was a narcissist that cared more about himself than what others looked like. But none of that mattered now, since none of it meant his mother would feel the same way. The utter shock on the elder Bakugo's face did nothing for the Spider-Girl's confidence, and she was one shriek away from bolting back to their room and hiding her head under a pillow. And fuck you, she absolutely would not be crying as she did so. Mitsuki pointed a shaking finger at the imposing form of the nervous Sylvette, which caused the girl to tense all 8 of her arachne-esque limbs. Katsuki scowled even harder. Legs comes home with me, Katsuki loudly declared, jumping to his feet, or there's no fucking deal. Unbeknownst to the explosive blonde, his outburst earned him a pleased grin from the still observing beau as well as a furious blush from the girl in question. On top of that, the entirety of the mess hall was now silent as a grave as all present tuned into the latest of the Bakugo family drama. Mitsuki. Well, Mitsuki nearly exploded right back at her son for his declaration. How in the flying fuck did you manage to land such a cutie, you brat? The Ashen Mother's explosion, however, was not at all what her combative son was expecting. Katsuki wasn't the only one flabbergasted by the elder blonde's scream. The entire population of the mess hall was shocked. Our house alone won't be big enough for all the babies. Immediately a wave of empathetic embarrassment was sent Katsuki's way from many of the onlookers. Mitsuki, completely oblivious, or just not caring, continued to ramble like a Midoriya. And she's going to need a whole backyard just to have room to exercise, that's important for expecting mothers, you know. Hey! Don't just jump to conclusions, you old hag. Katsuki finally managed to overcome his own shock and jumped onto the table to lunge at his mother, the faintest trace of a blush coloring his cheeks. Thankfully, Bo leaned forward and caught his charge by the scruff of his shirt collar, aborting the explosive blonde's attack. Rooted in place, Kanno was stuck in her own personal feedback loop, unable to decide how she felt about her roommate's mother's declaration. It was one thing to be hated on sight, another to be openly accepted and welcomed, but what had just happened? Then the Sylvette's brain caught up with the words the Ashen Mother had shouted, and immediately words of mortified denial flowed through a panicked teenage mind. Mrs. Bakugo, it really isn't like that. Kanno sputtered, arms flailing in mortification, it's just... And as these two teenagers took the first steps to standing back up after life had knocked them down, another was just beginning to spiral out of control. That evening, Mizurufu Police Station. The day-to-day hustle and bustle of the headquarters of Mizurufu's local non-hero peacekeepers was muted. Officers continued to file paperwork, book small-time villains and low-level crooks, and even refill the communal coffee pot, sure. But each and every ear in the bullpens was, at the same time, unrepentantly turned to one specific room where the juiciest gossip imaginable was about to unfold. Mizurufu Police Station, Interrogation Room #2? Detective Tsukachi sat at the single table in the room and made no effort to hide the scowl he was glaring into the teenager sitting across from him. The 15-year-old could have easily passed as a midget, he was so small, but a baby face and childish voice did nothing to mask eyes that, even now, overflowed with lust only just kept in check by fear. Minoru Mineta, the teen in question, had finally defaulted on the devil's luck he'd danced with so far throughout his life. Tsukachi had easily found the diminutive ball-headed boy's unofficial rap sheet, pages filled with reports of improper behavior of all sorts, and honestly, the man was shocked and more than a little pissed off. This had been a long time coming in the detective's opinion. He just hated the reason it had become his problem. The thought alone threatened to fling him back into blinding rage. Mineta-san, tell me. Exactly why did you think you would get away with what you did? Tsukachi asked, his anger barely contained behind a veneer of professionalism. He was trying not to take this personally, but it was hard. Sexual harassment and assault, in a public place no less, are both severe offenses. Mineta's near non-existent jaw dropped, incredulous at the detective's words. It wasn't sexual harassment. Or assault. The diminutive teen shouted, small fists pathetically thumping against the lone table. I paid good money for a good time, and that skank refused to deliver. It wasn't supposed to have turned out like this. All he'd wanted was a little time to decompress and enjoy himself. Mineta, for the umpteenth time, internally quailed at how his simple trip to the edge of Muzurafu's red light district had led to him sitting cuffed at the local police station. It was supposed to be simple, just a quick trip over the weekend to enjoy some adult fun after suffocating under Aizawa's thumb since his so-called therapist had turned in that report. Talking Kaminari and Shiro into joining him had been simple, his two taller classmates almost as desperate as he'd been for some positive attention. After Hell Week and that horrible post-USJ exam, they'd all agreed they deserved it. The plan had been cake too. The trio had skimmed some sites using Mineta's dark web browser and found that while the red light district itself was a no-go zone for heroes in training, rumor had it that the edge of the infamous area was more of a gray area than a solid line. So all they needed to do was find an amiable business in that ambiguous zone that wouldn't mind servicing patrons of their age, hire some pretty ladies there that fit their tastes, and enjoy themselves while they blew off some steam. Wasn't that what escorts were for? Apparently not. Unlike Mineta's last experience in a shadier side of town, which had been back in Yokohama, Kanagawa, the red light district in Muzurafu had turned out to be much more rigidly divided. Businesses on the edge weren't at all like those farther in, the shadier ones he'd been so fervently searching for. Case in point, the establishment he and the other two had ended up settling on hadn't seen the profession of escort as just another name for prostitution, like the diminutive teen had. Escorts aren't prostitutes, Mineta-san, Tsukachi deadpanned, his grip so tight under the table that the detective was sure his knuckles were bleeding white. He relentlessly crushed the flare of fury that threatened to erupt in his stomach. I believe you were repeatedly told exactly what you were and were not buying. Well, they sure charge as much. Mineta cried in response, wringing his tiny hands in a fit of nerves. I thought that old hag was just saying that crap to cover her ass, you know? Tsukachi paused, taking a deep breath before he did something he'd regret. The teen in front of him had gone from a slight frustration to a migraine-inducing aggravation. His attitude, even now, was appalling, and what he just said? That old hag has a name, Mineta-san, the irate detective grit out, taking another deep breath for good measure. And for your sake you better remember it before this conversation is over. Mineta did the smart thing for once, and shut up with a gulp of utter terror. Now, tell me what happened, Tsukachi ordered. The diminutive purple-headed teen nodded as quickly as he could, eager to comply with the scary man in front of him. Well, I mean, Kaminari and Shiro and I. We looked up some places that were in the Akayan, Mineta stuttered out, hand-wringing returning with a vengeance. And we found the garden. It had 5 stars. The detective internally almost cursed, leaning on years of cultivated patience to keep from pushing the pathetic teen too hard too soon. Everything said had been the truth, but not what he'd wanted to hear. Instead of outwardly reacting, Tsukachi merely raised a brow as he began to write in his notebook. So we go, right? It's not illegal or anything for us to go there, Mineta continued, hardly pausing to breathe, he was speaking so quickly. And it's perfect. The girls were sexy and you missed the part where Yujiri, the madam, explained the rules because you were busy ogling, Tsukachi interrupted, unable to keep the bite from his voice. His flub didn't help his deteriorating temper either. Unlike your two friends apparently. Filled with a sudden and idiotic rush of indignation, Mineta straightened up and smacked his tiny fists down onto the table. That's not fair. The disgrace of a hero in training whined, I heard the so-called rules. We bought the date night package. For the duration we were supposed to have our perfect matches. And as long as we had them back before 10:30 we could do whatever we wanted. Tsukachi said nothing, simply stared hard at the slowly cringing teen. The detective knew exactly what the disgraceful teen was talking about, and was just waiting for a lie to jump on. Unfortunately, Mineta gulped, realizing at the last second what he was about to say. Swallowing thickly, the midget continued after a brief and sullen pause. Within reason. The detective exhaled heavily as he wrote one last detail in his notebook. It was always more annoying when a perp was smart enough to. But she winked at me. Mineta suddenly exploded. Tsukachi sighed, putting his pen back to paper. His head hurt. It's true. She winked right after the boss lady said the girls were under no obligation to go further in the date than they wanted. It was a sign. I'm telling you. Tsukachi glared up from his notes, that hadn't felt entirely like the truth. More like wishful thinking mixed with delusion poured over a spotty recollection. Fortunately, he knew more about this particular business, its owner, and her employees than probably anyone else, and he was pretty damn sure it hadn't been a wink the diminutive teen had been given. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. A sign of what? The detective asked lowly. Mineta, survival instinct temporarily subdued by a misplaced feeling of vindication, sat back and crossed his arms triumphantly. It was a sign that things could go further. A moment of silence filled the room as Tsukachi tried to figure out the thought process of the disgrace to heroes in training sitting before him. Said disgrace sat back with a small, self-assured smile on his face. And what part of "no" do you not understand? The smile deflated faster than a parade balloon introduced to a pair of scissors. Tsukachi slowly put his notebook down and stood up. A young and cherubic face. Tears and running makeup. A dress torn and tattered. That young face again, but on a child, smiling uncertainly as weathered hands wiped away weeks' worth of grime and sorrow. A dark alley with a spark of hope in shining eyes. It was all too easy to lean forward, break into Mineta's personal space, and scowl menacingly. The diminutive teen was suddenly too terrified to move a muscle. But I paid. But not too terrified to speak. I even of FF offered extra money. Only after that poor girl endured a night full of attempts to corral her into dark alleys and love motels, Tsukachi growled. Only after her distaste at your perversion became too great to hide. And then, instead of being a better man and allowing her to return to the garden, you commit the ultimate mistake when she tried to leave. Tsukachi leaned in even further, getting right up into Mineta's face. The midget whimpered at the fire he saw in the detective's hard obsidian gaze. You used your quirk. And no. A lie. Minoru Mineta, you used your quirk, pop off, in an attempt to trap the escort you'd hired after she made every clear effort to leave your presence. Tsukachi roared, the act of catching the pathetic excuse for a young man in front of him in a falsehood overtaking the detective's already frayed controlled mannerism. You used your balls to trap her against a wall, and when she struggled against your manhandling, you proceeded to start tearing apart her dress. Tears were streaming down Mineta's widened eyes. This was it, the moment he'd always feared. He was going to lose any chance of becoming a hero the ladies would love right here. And all because of a stupid bitch who'd lied about what she was offering. How far would you have gone if I hadn't just happened to see the two of you as I passed by on my way to an informant? Tsukachi pressed, smelling blood in the water. How far, Mineta? The trapped teen shook his head frantically, curling inward and away from the force of righteous fury that was bearing down upon him. It was too much. Too much. Tsukachi pulled back, breathing heavily as he glared openly at the disgrace cowering in its chair. What was that? The detective asked curtly. Just a prostitute man. Mineta repeated, barely raising his voice above a whisper. All will to cover his actions had crumbled. I paid F for her. Boom. She is not a prostitute. There was murder in Tsukachi's eyes as the detective slammed his fists into the table. The continued slandering had reached the point of unforgivable. Prostitution was not Yujiri's business. He would know. The men and women in blue eavesdropping in on the interrogation collectively blinked in stunned awe. The diminutive teen might have just signed his future's death warrant, if he hadn't already. To be fair, the kid didn't know what he'd just done. Or who he'd just insulted for the umpteenth time. Before Tsukachi could say or do anything more, the door to the interrogation room swung open, revealing the unmistakable silhouette of well-built man in a suit. The newcomer walked into the fluorescent lighting, revealing the deathly calm face of Sakamoto, UA's personal lawyer. Allow me to take it from here, detective, Sakamoto said, smooth voice rolling over Mineta like a snake. For some reason, the diminutive teen didn't think he wanted the lawyer to take it. Maybe it was the cold disgust that shone through the man's blank mask? As you're well aware, this young man is a student of UA. And, due to recent events, it is felt that he needs to face the reprimands of the school before you get too far into things. Mineta shivered again. Dread couldn't even begin to describe what the disgrace of a hero in training was feeling bubble up in his stomach at that moment. Examining the newcomer, who'd technically interrupted an official interrogation, a pregnant moment came and went before Tsukachi swiftly snatched up his notebook and stomped over to the door Sakamoto had just entered through. "Fine," the detective groused, gripping the doorknob tightly, "I suppose I have a few phone calls to make anyway." With that, Tsukachi not so much slammed the door behind him as closed it, forcefully. Sakamoto sighed. He hated stepping into police business before it was finished. But this had to be done sooner rather than later. "Minoru Mineta, whether you know me or not is inconsequential," Sakamoto said, breaking the silence. Said teen hesitantly looked up at the figure that now, even suddenly sitting right in front of him, towered over him. "All you need to know is that my words are those of UA, and they are final." Mineta gulped, a cold sweating breaking out across his small frame. Sakamoto reached down, and pulled out a manila envelope from seemingly nowhere. The innocuous package was placed on the table without fanfare. "Minoru Mineta, you are hereby held to be in contempt of the tenets of UA's charter on multiple accounts," the lawyer began. The diminutive teen whimpered and closed his eyes. "You have been found to be guilty of numerous crimes and offenses that are all both debased and irreconcilable with the profession of heroism. Due to these findings, and the proof thereof, you are forthwith expelled from UA High School." At that moment, Mineta felt his heart stop. His dream of paradise cracked. And the nightmare wasn't over yet. "It is also the official decision of the Hero Association that you be banned from this point onward from ever pursuing the career colloquially known as Pro Hero ing," Sakamoto continued. "You are of course free to appeal these decisions, but you are also encouraged to remember the repercussions of retaliatory litigation against the former and latter parties mentioned." Now Mineta's dream not only cracked, but shattered. He was no longer a hero in training. He was a nothing. Sakamoto continued to speak for a time after that, but Mineta hardly heard a word. The diminutive teen had slipped into a waking coma, his mind unable to process what had just happened. He'd known he'd screwed up, gotten caught, but it had happened before. This was the first time he'd actually faced real consequences for what he'd done. His life was over? Far away from the despondent midget, Kaminari and Siro could be found still out enjoying their respective dates. The two had been told early on that they were honestly rather shitty dates, however, instead of getting discouraged the duo had taken the critiques to heart. At that very moment in fact, the blonde and Noirette were being offered the chance for pointers on how to become men that women would actually be attracted to. And as it meant the possibility for real dates in the future, the pair were more than eager to agree to the lessons. One day before the sports festival, UA main campus, principal's office. "I'm in trouble, aren't I?" What else could one Izuku Midoriya say as he stood before an assortment of men and women he could hardly look in the eye? And what else could he say when those men and women were part of UA's school board? With the sinister nature of cursed blood, and how much trouble he'd been involved in since being accepted, the Verdinet was surprised he hadn't been called before the board before now. It had really only been an inevitability, especially with the sports festival right around the corner. Trying to remain optimistic, as Tsuchan had basically demanded of him, unless the worst actually did happen, Izuku did his best to suppress his darker worries. Who knew, maybe he was only going to be asked to refrain from participating in the festival of his own free will. Feeling the worry radiating from their master, boss, and big brother, the trio of zombie girls that had followed Izuku to the meeting leveled crimson glares at the gathered adults. "Not at all, Midoriya-san." Nizu chirped quickly, eager to dispel any notion that there was about to be a confrontation. The quirked animal knew, whether they portrayed it or not, that the men and women sitting to either side of him were incredibly nervous under the blatantly hostile eyes of Izuku's partners. He wanted to defuse the situation before it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. "In fact, we called you here specifically to speak to you about how to handle your publicity situation and the media's constant harassment." The easy assurance of the principal allowed Izuku to visibly relax. His partners, not so much. Indeed, one of the board members said, the plaque in front of the large man reading, "Public Relations." "The sad truth is that, while you've more than proved yourself to be an upstanding member of society, there are still those who would wish to vilify you and your quirk." There was a round of nods, a quiet unanimous agreement to the unfortunate statement. Izuku viciously squeezed down on the self-recrimination that tried to boil up from his stomach. Unlike in the past, he knew better now. He believed better now. He was not what those vultures said he was. It also goes without saying that those interested parties will be keeping their eyes on you during the sports festival, Midoriya-san, public relations continued, looking hesitantly to his peers before turning back to Izuku. And they will not hesitate to exaggerate any perceived misbehavior from your quirks, attachments for their own benefit. Oi! The board seemed to move as one, each and every member flinching back from the growled shout. We're not just accessories the boss carries around for shits and giggles. Saki snarled, voicing her displeasure at being labeled a mere attachment. Before the blonde zombie girl could really let loose on the geezers who'd insulted her and her sisters, Izuku turned and began to calm the delinquent down with an affectionate smile and head pats. The sight was sweet enough to give a person diabetes. Yes, well, the real concern here is that, while the school staff has been made well aware of the capabilities and, understood, behavior of your creatures, the minions, the board member with security stamped on her plaque trailed off as she stumbled over how to correctly label the zombie girls in a way that wouldn't offend followers. An uncomfortable silence grew as the adults failed to brainstorm a solution to a problem that didn't need to exist. Lily thinks friends would be best. Lily offered, pouting at the stupidity of the adults. The entire issue shouldn't have even mattered. Big Brother calls us partners, too. Tay gave a barely audible huff. Friends, right. Security said, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to waste time and goodwill on the matter. Anyway, while the staff members aren't a concern, the fact of the matter is that many students, and the public at large, are either unaware of said capabilities or completely ignorant of their existence. Izuku furrowed his brows. The green-haired teen wasn't quite sure what the connection was here. I'm sorry, I don't understand, the young necromancer said, fidgeting in place. The board member seemed unsure how to continue, so he took the opportunity to speak. What does people not knowing my quirk have to do with the sports festival? The older woman sitting next to the pinkette-marked security sighed and adjusted both of her horn-rimmed glasses. Steepling her hands behind her own plaque labeled finances, the board member's two pairs of eyes bore into Izuku. Midoriya-san, UA's sports festival is the biggest event in Japan, arguably even this entire hemisphere, finances, said completely without a hint of pride or arrogance, as if she spoke an undeniable truth. Its greater purpose outside of entertainment is to serve as a vehicle of exposure. Students get publicity of course, but more importantly, the public, hero agencies, and support companies are given an unrestricted view of up-and-coming heroes. Finances took a deep breath before sighing, a look of consternation weighing down her aged visage. However, we will not lie to you here, the elderly woman continued. The festival is also a tool for UA to maintain its various sponsorships and, in the best of cases, attract new ones. Izuku blinked, surprised he'd never considered such an angle before. It made sense though, an institution as vaunted as UA would without a doubt need vast amounts of support to keep operating at the level it was famous for. And while he was sure alumni donated when they could, the Verdinet was also sure that not even All Might made enough to make too much of a dent in the Academy's budget. Your quirk poses a threat, Haruno-san. For one so small, Nizu could be incredibly imposing when he wanted to be. The principal curtailed Haruno-san's lack of tact without hardly moving a paw, but the middle-aged woman sat back as if slapped by someone with a strength-enhancing quirk. You may be new to your position, Nizu chastised, glaring at the board member with a venomous look, but I will not forgive any of my students being mistreated. Tay's low growling did wonders for driving the principal's point home to those who might have otherwise internally scoffed at the quirked animal's words. There were no objections to the reprimand. I apologize, Haruno said, the pinkette's tone in no way expressing remorse. I only meant to get to the point. It wasn't my intention to hurt anyone's tender sensibilities. Izuku leaned back and calmed his undead partners before their hackles could even fully rise up from the thinly veiled insult. The Verdinet did have to wonder, as he gave out head pats, just how such a person as this Haruno woman could make it onto the board. Then again, if he hadn't even considered UA sponsors existing, there was probably all sorts of business the Academy dealt with that he probably hadn't even conceived of yet. How is my quirk a threat? The young necromancer asked once he'd gotten Tay and Saki relaxed. Lily, instead of being on the verge of an outburst like her sisters, was instead getting teary-eyed. That required a hug, which Izuku was more than happy to give. What he wasn't happy about was the silence that answered his rather simple question. When none of the board members spoke up after a handful of minutes, Izuku turned to finance. The elderly woman looked away in shame. Midoriya-san. Public relations finally broke the quiet, mirroring finance. There are some sponsors that are quirkists. It was like a band-aid being ripped off, the realization catching Izuku in the chest with a painful sting. So that was why he'd been called here. Your quirk is without question powerful, public relations pushed on, still unable to look at the young necromancer in front of him. But not many know its true nature as a mutant type. This will undoubtedly be revealed during the course of the sports festival. And with your allies? The large board member hesitated again, his sighs belaying his soft heart. Unwilling to allow this meeting to drag on, Haruno gave a grunt loud enough to gain herself the attention of the room. There will be accusations of foul play if you participate with all your friends, and win any of the stages of the festival, the Pinkette laid out bluntly. Even if one of them is less than present, it would still be lambasted as unfair external aid. And that doesn't even begin to address the matter my peers seem to find too distasteful to speak on. Izuku failed to suppress an itwitch at the thinly veiled disgust tainting Haruno words. Principal Nizu, Izuku said, deciding it would be better for his health to just ignore the others in the room. How does all this affect my participation? Am I being asked to drop from the sports festival? At first, the quirked animal didn't answer. Locking eyes with the principal, the young necromancer realized it was because Nizu was doing his best not to lose control of the frustration and shame that were leaking out behind his beady black gaze. It had been an impossible decision, and still Nizu hated himself for being unable to escape making it. The situation had just been too delicate, too last minute, and his influence just not strong enough in the correct areas to allow for any other outcome, even with high spec. Midoriya's numerous victories, small as they were, had finally caught up to him and had gained the attention of agencies across the board, hero and support-oriented alike. At first it had just been the mid-level support company that UA contracted out incoming freshmen's hero suits to. When the young hero in training had gone to another student, one Mei Hatsum, to not only upgrade their original work, but to also build and patent a new ballistic material the two had invented together to use in said upgrades, the contractor had threatened to sue. Then the Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, or BSAA as it was known internationally, had caught wind of the more undead aspect of Midoriya's quirk. The organization had attempted to claim all three zombies through official channels numerous times, stating only that the girls might be infectious as the single support to their demands. And just the other week a small religious group, as rare as religion was in this day and age, had contacted UA condemning the academy for aid and abetting the devil's agent. When the group's imbecilic letters had gone unanswered, call had been made that openly threatened protest and boycotting unless the undead abominations were destroyed. All of these separate incidents had been squashed, quieted, or ignored handedly thanks in no small part to Nizu's careful administration. They were, however, a stark reminder on just how staunch opposition to so-called dark quirks would always face. Had the petition been submitted earlier, as it should have, Nizu said, emphasizing exactly how unhappy he was about the whole ordeal, then we could have worked out at least a fair compromise. The quirked animal lightly bowed his head to Izuku, shocking all present. Midoriya-san, it is to my shame that such a deal could not be made, Nizu apologized. Unwilling to allow the board a chance to speak and attempt to cover their asses, the principal pushed on without missing a beat. However, we cannot ask you to absent yourself from such an important event. Instead, I must ask that you register your partners as special gear. This means that their participation in the sports festival will be heavily restricted, but thankfully not entirely forbidden. Izuku accepted the polite demand with aplomb, only exchanging glances with his three partners. Saki and Lily shrugged, although neither looked too happy with the decision. Tay stared into the infinite, as she was prone to do. The final agreement hasn't been finalized yet, Nizu finished, sounding personally hurt at the idea he was party to handicapping such a prodigious student. However, you should be prepared for only being allowed a single supporter for only one event. Luckily, if you wish to file a complaint. I understand, Izuku interrupted softly, earning a number of scandalized stares. I'll just need to shine without my quirk then. Nizu winced at the sarcasm seething beneath the serene tone of his green-haired student. The quirked animal hoped that his standing with the young necromancer hadn't just been irreparably damaged. The rest of the meeting was spent under a miasma of sinister tension. Izuku, hurt by the treatment his partners were being forced to suffer, and his three partners, who took offense to their master, boss, Big Brother being considered a danger, made no effort to relieve the pressure building between them and the board. After the meeting came to a close, and the Viridian hero in training and various board members had departed, Nizu stayed behind. I swear to you Midoriya-kun, Nizu vowed to the empty chamber, that I will do my damnedest to make sure that you never suffer such discrimination again. The meeting room's autolight timed out, throwing the principal into pitch darkness. It was an adequate metaphor for his mood. And I swear to change UA's sponsors after this. At the very least, I think it's about time to wrest some influence away from those pests. The opening day of the sports festival, first-year competition, UA Sports Festival Stadium. It had taken a monumental logistical force, nearly a whole prefecture worth of extra pro-hero security, and more than a few public relations miracles, but the first day of UA High School Sports Festival had kicked off with a whirlwind of activity that would one day make the history books. Japan's greatest event had begun just as intended. Scattered throughout the stadium were food stands and memorabilia shops, many operated by recent business and support course graduates, that gave all attendees an opportunity to grab snacks and knickknacks before the real fun began. A generally lighthearted and jovial mood pervaded the air as the massive screens mounted on the stadium's walls counted down. Everyone important for the festival's success was happy. Unfortunately for one Izuku Midoriya, he learned that day that everyone important didn't necessarily mean the students. As he stood in the waiting room for Class 1A, the young necromancer was, in a word, upset. After signing the request for special gear that morning, the Verdinet had learned exactly how bad the odds were going to be stacked against him. For the entirety of the first two events, he would be unable to utilize his partners at all, and if he made it to the third, he would have to switch partners every round. It didn't take a lot of his prodigious brainpower to catch on that those putting pressure on the board and the principal didn't expect him to do very well on his own. Izuku felt he should have been angrier than he actually was, but that might have had something to do with the fact that he wasn't the only competitor who'd had undue restrictions levied against them. A number of his classmates from 1A, and even those from the other hero class and other courses, had been forced to sign requests like him, even though none were quite so severe. Sato was being limited to only 2 doses of 10 grams of sugar total for the first 2 events. Koda could take an animal with him into the first 2 events, but only one that could fit in his hands. Kurwaro had been outright denied his petition for a Vantablack-coated cloak unless he made it to the third event. Conversely, Aoyama had been allowed his belt, no restrictions at all. Those affected had wanted to cry foul, but this is so unfair. Izuku mumbled, smiling sadly as he was given a gentle pat on the back. They're not even trying to be impartial. Tsuyu came around from behind the Verdinet and hugged herself to him in a show of open affection. Izuku hugged back instinctively. You should have told Mom about his, Karo, the frog girl chided, the love and support suffusing her voice softening the bite of her words. You know she would have gladly eviscerated those assholes who demanded this. The young necromancer was fairly certain that the Azui matriarch wouldn't have just metaphorically eviscerated the quirkists responsible if given the chance. The thought made the Verdinet chuckle. To separate you from your partners, the manifestation of your formidable darkness. Fumikage groused, joining the couple to show his support of his friend. It is akin to cleaving your very body in twain. The declaration, over the top though it was, brought tears of happiness to Izuku's eyes. The hero in training couldn't explain how good it felt to be understood. And by those he could call friends no less. Far off and many stories above him, Izuku could feel Tei, Lily, and Saki's worry for him slightly ease as his roiling emotions began to balance out. The young necromancer could tell his partners were glad that he wasn't alone during this difficult time. You know, Kyuka drawled as she came up and leaned against Fumicage's side, slapping a hand on Izuku's shoulder at the same time, wouldn't it be rad if you won this whole shindig even with that handicap of yours? The scales of Izuku's emotion swung fully into joy. The undying support of his girlfriend, friends, and family was making his life feel brighter, and much easier to deal with. Hey! Hey! Izuchi! Izuchi! With no warning, Mei Hatsum appeared in 1A's prep room, the Pinkette's bad habit of invading Izuku's personal space causing Tsuyu to tighten her hold on her boyfriend protectively. Where's Blondie? I need her to look at my gear before the competition starts. Normally, this would have sounded like an odd request, especially coming from the support course's pink demon. But as it turned out, Saki's quirk, Gearhead, had been just what the mad scientist had ordered. The blonde delinquent was able to completely understand the analogical details of any machinery she touched. She could find flaws no matter how small, and could pinpoint areas of improvement in seconds. These abilities had come to light when Saki had first been taken to Mei's workshop and had started listing weaknesses in the inventor's work as she picked up the Pinkette's babies one by one. After 4 hours of being inundated by the Pinkette's inventions, the zombie girl had thrown herself out of the support course's wing of UA. That hadn't stopped Power Loader from asking Izuku if the delinquent could swing by his development classes in her free time though. But none of that mattered at the moment, because Izuku didn't even get a chance to reply to his overzealous friend before the sports festival's opening ceremony had begun. Same time, UA Sports Festival Stadium, first year's box seats. Will Izuenii be alright on his own? Lily asked, uncomfortable being so far away from her big brother. The littlest zombie was full of worry and aching for a reassuring head pat, but the entire seating area around the three undead was empty. Lily doesn't like that Izu and I is alone. Gia. Tay's sudden grunt gained the frayed attention of her younger sisters. Saki snorted in response. Of course he isn't alone. The rebellious zombie girl seconded, arms crossed with a savage grin plastered across her face. Besides, the boss is too much of a badass to be stopped by a couple of greedy old farts who don't know shit. Down below, the 18-plus heroine Midnight had taken the stage. The already hyped cheers of the crowd rose in volume, appreciation for the risque pro lighting a fire under many. Saki squinted, still having that lingering feeling that the voluptuous Ravenette looked familiar, as if she had seen here before attending UA, but as someone else. The delinquent's thoughts were pulled away as the pulsing music that had been vibrating her ribcage suddenly ceased. What's up, people? It's time to kick this festival into gear. Can I get a Yeowea? The amplified voice of the pro-hero present mic belted out from the stadium speakers, whipping the crowd into an even crazier frenzy. All right, let's not waste any time then. The voice hero screamed with a flourish. They're the heroic sensation that's enraptured the nation. They've already survived a villain attack and show no sign of slowing down. It's Class 1A. As the young heroes in training took the field, Tay continued to stare unblinkingly at Izuku. The eldest zombie girl's face remained impassive, seemingly dead eyes failing to convey the depth of feeling transmitting through their bond. While the young necromancer was getting better, any extra cheering up he could have he deserved. Izuku jerked his gaze upward, locking eyes with his oldest partner. A single smile. Thankfulness and fondness flowed freely. A sense of empowerment filled the partners. Distance and physical separation meant nothing in the face of their bond. For a certain other trio one section over, however, all was not well. These three were doing their utmost best to not fuck up their latest assignment. There they are. A red-headed woman hissed, peeking out from her cover, designed to look like a janitorial service cart, at the three undead girls. Just as the informant said, no supervision, and no leash. If those things had the slightest provocation. To any onlooker, the woman was just a suspicious janitor glaring at a group of girls. Only a single armband, emblazoned with the letters QRA, revealed her true affiliations as an agent in disguise. An agent, much to her frustration, that had failed to acquire a sample of undead flesh not too long ago. Such blatant disregard for public safety is the most unsightly example of negligence imaginable. A man with shoulder-length periwinkle hair added with a disturbing smile. Images of a fat paycheck floated before his eyes. It is our public duty to protect the world from such troubles. Nightmarish monsters like those could go feral at any moment. The man was dressed like his partner, as a simple janitor with an armband on the opposite arm, and his motivation was similar to the woman's as well. The humiliation he'd endured recently demanded repayment, and a resounding success here would wipe away the memory of serving as the division's clown very nicely. Musashi. Kojiro. The high-pitched and scratchy voice calling their names snapped both agents from their thoughts. A diminutive figure stood between the two, no taller than 4 feet flat, frowning in disappointment. Remember. We are only cleared to watch and wait. Intervention comes only when strictly necessary. You two better not cause any further problems for the boss, got it? Naya. The third wheel to the group of agents at first glance appeared to be a preteen boy. This was unfortunate, as the man was decidedly not that young, and hated being reminded of such. Mutant genetics had kept his face young though, as well as granted him feline features such as cat ears that poked out of short-cut teal hair and a tail. Correction. At first glance, the veteran agent looked like a preteen cosplayer. No need to remind us Nianta-senpai, Musashi grumbled, petulant that she'd been scolded. We're well aware of our standing in this situation. Don't worry, we weren't planning on doing anything stupid, Kojiro added, doing his best not to gulp under the sharp golden-eyed glare of his superior. Jumping the gun isn't even our style. Nianta narrowed his eyes at the pair of rowdy agents he'd been stuck with, not for the first time cursing the Persian bitch that had seduced his boss and had him sent away to babysit these idiots. The veteran's glowering might have looked more intimidating if he hadn't been wearing an adorable-looking hoodie with denim shorts and a child's pair of sneakers. Then tell me why you're packing reinforced nets and 4 pairs of bolas, Nianta demanded, not asked, as he pointed at the sack laying open at the duo's feet. You two understand how that looks, right? Naya. Musashi nudged the sack until its opening was covered by excess material. We're just being cautious. The redhead defended, preparing for an eventuality doesn't mean we're planning on forcing it. That's right, Kojiro said, perhaps a little too fast. It's not like we're going to strike first unprovoked or anything. Again, Nianta cursed that damn Persian bitch. Standing a woman up one time in Paris should not result in torture like this. It hadn't even been his fault he'd forgotten his promise to meet her at that hotel. He'd gotten distracted by a lovely Egyptian wench. The same one that had put that golden ring on his finger. That last thought brought with it a familiar heat to the veteran's cheeks, and then the catboy, man, noticed that his entire body was heating up. What the? Move. The trio of QRA agents nearly jumped out of their skin. Turning as one, the three came face to face with none other than the number 2 hero, Endeavor. The flame hero, best known for his harsh attitude, paid the trash in his way no mind. The ironically cold man had his eyes laser-focused on the upcoming festival events, his thoughts divided between two fronts today. On one hand, his current masterpiece was set to make its first public appearance, and its most important first impression, as a hero in training. On the other, his current target was about to be pushed until it revealed whatever its true capabilities were. He'd know, he'd made sure of it. As President Mike belted out the remaining courses and first-year students filed onto the field, Endeavor had no idea that his eyes were not the only ones to settle upon the young necromancer. For many, the wait was over. The truth of cursed blood was about to be revealed. Omake, delivery report. One of the perks of my job is that, when the rare opportunity appears, I can enjoy a bit of revenge. Sometimes it's a petty thing, other times it's well-deserved vindication. But, it's always fulfilling to watch haughty villains and criminals suffer some karmic retribution. Agent Sato. I call out the code name of the man in front of me, a spook if I'd ever seen one. Sometimes I wonder if the naming convention truly is actually all about keeping anonymity, or if it's some type of joke. The living mountain in front of me turns in my direction. The guy fit the bill of a classic Austrian bodybuilder so perfectly it was almost stereotypical. But I didn't have room to talk. Our own Agent Smith has long since checked all the boxes of the quintessential Japanese beauty. I have questions about your last mission. Of course, this is just a formality. We all understand that the mission was a success, but a couple of blanks still need to be filled. Agent Sato gave curt nod in response. I'd heard many of my coworkers call the solemn response intimidating, but after dealing with Smith's antics more than any sane man should have to, the man's coolness was actually appreciated. The first and most important question, did the package arrive at the gates of Void Hell Prison? Yes. A simple answer. I scratched down a note. Placing my pen aside, I breathed a sigh of relief and began to relax. That had been my job for the day. Ask a question, and more than likely get a monosyllabic answer. Easy. Now for the part that most others couldn't handle. Off the record. Was it really necessary to kill all 17 of the package's attackers? Seeing Agent Sato raise a brow at my question actually gave me goosebumps. I'd never gotten that response before, but perhaps it was warranted? The spook had reported killing 17 villains on this mission alone, a particularly high count for a new resident of Void Hell. It wasn't that the attacks hadn't been expected, just not in that quantity. And far as I knew, Agent Sato either hadn't made use of his quirk, or more likely, was quirkless. Don't get me wrong, we couldn't accuse you of anything if we tried. It's just that, if one had been captured, we could have held a real gold mine of an interrogation. Of course you could have. You just got your hands on the most powerful truth serum in existence. I nearly flinch. That was not a monosyllabic answer. And it pricked at my conscience. Midoriya's quirk was already well known among the spooks. He'd been earmarked before he even finished his first year at UA. Sometimes I feel an itch to tell the poor boy about what joining such characters will do to his life. Call it biased, but the scuttlebutt about a spook's life sounds like something no child deserves. And then I have to hold back from smacking myself in the face as I remember that my country is already making Midoriya's life miserable. I had every intention of leaving the last one for you. As a gift. But then she decided to kill herself. I don't know which is scarier, that the spook can speak of death and murder like they're ingredients in a cake recipe, or that his accent made it impossible to tell his nationality. Remembering the crime scene photos of the attackers, I had to wonder. Was Agent Sato just numb to the horrors of the level of carnage he could create, or did he enjoy his work? Were any of the attackers attempting to rescue the Trinity Raven? No. Back to monosyllabic answers. Some might have seen that as a good thing. Are you sure? I hated asking that question. You don't question spooks like that. You especially don't question spooks like that when you had pictures of mauled-to-death villains back at the office on your desk. Villains that the man you just questioned had dealt with his bare hands. Yes. A few even managed to put a couple rounds in the Raven's chest. The kid's blood sure is powerful. I sighed at that statement. Of course they'd managed to shoot a Karuga. Even a spook, if alone, would have had trouble dealing with snipers. It was a good thing imagining the Trinity Raven bemoaning her survival, knowing she'd only be thrown into void hell for her trouble regardless, made this all worthwhile. Even so, in spite of the obstacles, the package arrived safe and alive, so the mission was a success. Japan thanks you for removing another such hazard from its soil. I had technically finished the session at that point, but there was something I needed to know before Agent Sato left, and I probably never saw him ever again. By the way the spook remained stationary and silent, I knew he'd guessed I had something I'd wanted to ask. One last question, if you would? Off the records, of course. Agent Sato nodded in his solemn way, as if he already knew what my question, personal as it was going to be. It felt kind of flattering to be taken so seriously. There, at the gates of oblivion, did she suffer? I watched as the spook's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, flat eyes looking back at a pleasant memory. A smile had never terrified me so deeply, and I'd seen the king of the underworld up close and personal. I watched as the raven's eyes returned to normal just as the gates began to close upon her. I saw her spirit, her very soul, come back to her and instantly break as the kid's blood finally burned out and stopped giving her strength. I couldn't breathe. The spook's voice was hypnotic. She looked back then, probably to see if the kid had come to see her off. She began to cry when she realized there was only me. I could almost imagine the scene. That once arrogant monster being reduced to a whimpering mess would have been sublime to see in person. As sick as it might have sounded, the image managed to warm my heart. Unfortunately, the gates closed before I could hear her scream. Well, you can't have everything. As I parted ways with the spook known as Agent Sato, I could only smile. This was a momentous occasion, something that needed to be celebrated. It looked like I'd be visiting the garden again tonight. Not that I imagined I'd be facing too much resistance. A sinister team. Izuku Midoriya wasn't as happy as he should have been today. Discovering the extent of the board's machinations had been a real blow to the green-haired teen and his recovering self-worth. While the rules and regulations he'd be forced to participate under weren't technically directed at him alone, the condemnation, or at least the clear discrimination to see the lesser garner the least amount of attention as possible, still hurt. After years of wallowing in self-loathing, being mistreated by the biased society he lived in, and eventually even living with the hatred and fear others held for his quirk's less than heroic nature, Izuku had finally tasted validation. His existence had been accepted, his efforts praised, and he'd even scored more than a few meaningful victories. The young necromancer's life of being functionally alone and miserable had seemingly ended with a single incident. Tsuchan had become a principal instigator in turning his entire world around. The frog girl's love and support was more than Izuku had ever expected to have. Then his new light in the dark had brought her mother in, and the force of nature that was Baru Azui had stood squarely in his corner ever since. Even the Muzutafu police force, those who knew of his involvement anyway, now acknowledged his value as a person and a future hero. Was it any wonder the young hero in training would acquire a desire for more of the same? Was it any wonder that the Verdinet now felt that the sports festival should have been his opportunity, his golden chance, to show the public who he really was and what he could do? No. It was not. As the last of the business course students shuffled onto the field, the riotous crowd that had cheered on the first years to varying degrees quieted. A multitude of spotlights blazed through the energized stadium, converging one at a time on a single raised podium. Revealed to have been standing on the raised platform the entire time was Midnight, the 18-plus heroine. And let's hear it for our referee folks. Present Mick's amplified voice boomed through the speakers, injecting a fresh dose of energy into the air. She's the heroine that'll whip you into more than just shape, it's Midnight. As the camera drones zeroed in on her, the voluptuous heroine plastered on a bright smile and waved to the roiling waves of fans now cheering and chanting her name. It was always nice to see her popularity hadn't waned too much since she'd started her teaching career and had to cut back on hero work. Turning to wave to another portion of the stadium, a flash of emerald green caught Namuri Kayama's eye. A flicker of hesitation was all the pro-heroine allowed herself as her gaze crossed one Izuku Midoriya's before she continued on her circuit of crowd reception. There went her good mood. Not that it was the cinnamon roll's fault. Namuri was far from an airhead bimbo who only knew how to use her body and quirk to make it in life. She'd worked hard ever since she'd accepted as a child that her individuality wasn't combat-oriented to follow her dream of being a hero. She'd overcome the circumstances of her youth, put in months, years of hellish training to get her body and skills to peak condition, dealt with the consequences of her life choices, and had stood firm against every naysayer who'd looked down on her through it all. And after a lifetime of similar struggle, Midoriya's situation really ground her gears. And it wasn't just that the board had kept to their policies of thinly veiled discrimination against non-emitter type students. This year, the meddlesome old fucks had stepped onto her territory, and put their hands more directly on the sports festival than they ever had before. It wasn't a widely broadcast fact, mostly due to more machinations of the board, but by rights the highest-scoring participant in the practical exam was supposed to be given the mantle of freshman representative every year. The title was mostly a badge of honor, but it did entail being given the noteworthy task of giving the sportsman's oath before the first-year events began. It was a chance to scream to the world you were entering the festival as the best of the best. And it should have been Midoriya's chance, his right. However, the board, in its infinitely petty wisdom, had decided that this year, UA needed a more stable candidate to give the oath. The reasoning given was that the rightful candidate was still in the midst of controversy due to the publicized attack at the courtroom, and while he'd won the role of representative fair and square, it might give the wrong impression if the institution allowed him his deserved spotlight after the events of the USJ incident. The crusty fucks had then had the gall to ask Midoriya, to his face, if he'd willingly give the opening speech over to one of his classmates. Nizu had been beyond incensed. The quirked animal had still been furious even hours later when he'd called Namuri and told her of the new machinations she'd have to navigate the next day. Under her expertly crafted mask of licentiousness and sensuality, the pro-hero known as Midnight stewed in her impotent rage. A roguish grin hid a burning spark that had caught fire in the woman. This affront would not go unanswered. No sir. Down below the surreptitiously fuming heroine, and unaware of the new supporter her boyfriend had recently gained, amongst the assorted first years Tsuyu Azui leaned against Izuku's side and gave the Verdunette a tight hug. I know I agreed that a little revenge was in order, Karo. The frog girl whispered into the smirking Verdunette's ear, but I think you might have overdone it. Shrugging minutely in response, Izuku continued to smirk as Midnight finally ended her crowd greeting and turned back to the gathered students. All right everyone. The pro-heroine called, all eyes on her as her hand mic spread her voice throughout the stadium. Before we begin, let's hear it for the honored student chosen by the first-year representative to give the opening sportsman's oath. Confusion spread through both the students and surrounding crowd at the announcement like a virus. Representative? For many, it was the first time they'd ever heard of such a position. And it was this student that had chosen another to speak before the first event? Why hadn't this representative done it? Tenya Ida. Come on up. A quick pat on the back from a shocked Uraraka snapped the wide-eyed speedster from his own disbelief. The bespectacled teen didn't know who this representative was, but as he stiffly walked up to the podium Ida silently swore to himself that he would track said student down and thank him or her. Izuku suppressed a snort as he watched Midnight pass her mic to his replacement. Ida's nerves visibly kicked in as the poor Bluinette stiffened up like a statue, or a robot. There was a moment of silence as the speedster stood there, looking back at an expectant audience. He opened his mouth. The board wanted flashy? They wanted stable? Then how could they say no to Tenya Ida, younger brother of the current Ingenium and youngest of a family of popular heroes? Ida began to speak, and it was only because of the numerous cameras set up to record the sports festival from all angles that anyone would ever remember what was said. 10 minutes later? And that is why we, the newest generation of hero prospects, shall all do our utmost best in the following festivities. Thank you. There was a moment of silence. Was it over? Midnight shook herself, tearing away the daze that had settled over her, and all present as the youngest Ida had given his. Was that a speech, or a lecture? Maybe a eulogy? The 18-plus heroine wasn't sure, and she sure as hell wasn't going to waste any more time figuring it out. A smattering of confused applause, augmented by the sheer size of the stadium's seating capacity, was cue enough to get the ball rolling. Snatching the mic from her student, Midnight gently nudged the rigidly standing speedster from her podium. Once Ida had returned to his place beside his classmates, Namuri kicked back into gear. Thank you very much for that rousing speech, Ida-san, the 18-plus heroine shouted, breathing a little life back into the audience. Now how about we jump right into the first event? How's that sound, folks? If Ida had gotten an applause for his oath, then Midnight received a standing ovation for that single line. Grinning like a cat that had eaten the canary, the pro-heroine gestured behind her as a giant holographic spin dial came into being. So what's the first event going to be? Midnight questioned, her expert showmanship shining bright as the crowd went wild even before the enormous wheel began to turn. There she goes, folks. Where she lands, nobody, The rest of Namuri's rhyme was cut short as the wheel spun faster than the eye could follow before stopping on a dime. It was arguably the fastest a sports festival event had ever been chosen. Well, I guess I'm not the only one who's eager to see these hot-blooded freshmen in action. Midnight shouted, recovering quickly from the unexpectedly quick selection. Unbeknownst to the pro-heroine, she was far more on point than she knew. And it looks like an obstacle race? Izuku asked out loud, parroted by many of the other first years around him, seems kind of basic. But then again, UA is infamous for changing the details of their events every year, so even a repeated one would be entirely new. As the young necromancer had spoken, he and Tsuyu had filed over to the starting line, or rather, the tunnel they just walked through to enter into the stadium's main field. I don't know about that, Karo, the frog girl replied, frowning as an idea of why such an event would be first formed in her head, but I think they're trying to set the students against each other. Izuku frowned as well, considering his girlfriend's suggestion. It unfortunately made more sense than not. The objective of any race was to, obviously, come in first place by the end. In a race against a great number of others, as well as there being obstacles to overcome, it was clear that the intended purpose wasn't only to win this time, but to show off one's individual capabilities while doing so. The Verdant frankly thought that such a mindset was stupid. It was pointless to use placement in a race to measure heroic potential. Anyone with a quirk that offered physical reinforcement, regardless of whether or not that was its main function or just a side effect, would outperform the rest of the competitors. The glaring favoritism rankled against Izuku's sense of fairness. Such a trivial task. Fumikage groused as he took a spot next to Izuku against the wall of the tunnel. This will set loose the dogs of war, mark my words. The seeds of desire for baleful, empty glory will be planted amongst fertile soil with this. While overly dramatic, Izuku could see where his friend was coming from. I mean, they could be trying to show off how quick we all could be to get to disaster zones in emergencies, Kyuka threw out as she meandered her way to the group of friends, but honestly, I think they're just trying to eliminate the least athletic and flashy. Fumikage briefly caught the eye of the musically inclined heroine in training, the two looking away just as quickly. Kyuka suddenly coughed into her arm, covering her slightly blushing cheeks. Which sucks, the punk rock teen continued, doing her best to ignore what had just happened. I hate these types of competitions. I'm not built to run like a horse. A passing student, a foreign girl with large horns sticking out of her head and hooves for feet, made no reaction to Kyuka's words, unable to follow the musical teen's quick speaking. Izuku's other friend also had a point. While being able to get to the scene of a crime, accident, or disaster quickly was paramount to heroes being able to do their jobs, sadly, not every pro was the epitome of physical fitness. From his years of observation, many rarely even engaged in anything more strenuous but the most basic forms of athletic activity, just enough to keep their bodies slightly above the average citizen. Overuse of quirks, leaning more on the clever application of tactics, teamwork, these were all alternatives that allowed the lesser capable to outshine the lone wolves who were the pinnacle of what used to be seen as peak human fitness. Wait. That gave Izuku an idea. Do you think there would be complaints if we team up for this? The young necromancer asked, looking to his friends and girlfriend. The three gave the Verdant questioning looks. I mean, I haven't heard it being forbidden. All right, little listeners. Before we begin, remember, anything goes. Present Mick's quirk amplified voice pierced into the tunnel like there wasn't tons of concrete separating the man from the competitors. Oh wait, no trying to harm or impede your fellow listeners. But that's it. We start in 5 minutes. The four friends exchanged glances. Fuck it. I'm in, Kyuka said, grinning widely. The musically quirks teen was sure she'd have come close to middle of the pack anyway, but why not cause some chaos with her pals? Karo. Tsuyu croaked in agreement. I shall join you in this revelry, my friends. Fumikage announced grandly, dark shadow poking out of his stomach with a thumbs up. Let us show these knaves that our mad banquet of darkness can shine like the brightest of lights. Slightly ahead of the now pumped-up quartet, one Shoto Todoroki was fighting through one of his own moments of darkness. These upcoming events will be your first official public spotlight on your own. Rumbled a deep voice, swallowed in smugness, you will drop your childish tantrum and blind everyone with your fire. Todoroki ground his teeth, forcing the bile in his throat down. Since he'd been a child, he'd done everything he could to become the opposite of his father. And just like that, the bastard had swept it all aside as if it meant nothing and had made his demands. We're the same Shoto, the burning source of all of the aforementioned teen's rage said, you and I are the best of the best. And the best won't stand to lose. I'll never be like him. Todoroki hissed under his breath, glaring at his left hand. The hatred seared through the bile in his throat, but the heterochromatic forced that down as well. And I'll never use his power. His bastard of a father wanted him to burn through all of the competition? Well, Shoto Todoroki would succeed, no doubt, but he would do so without letting out so much as an ember. His mother's power was more than enough for him to climb to the top. Endeavor could burn himself to ash for all he cared. I refuse to carry on that man's legacy. Todoroki continued, reaffirming his personal oath. An eye of turquoise and an eye of gray stared ahead balefully, nothing but aggression visible. And no one's going to stop me. And go. In seconds, Izuku discovered another major flaw in the first event. Absolutely the bare minimum stuck to the spirit of heroism. Get off my foot. Shut up and get out of my way. Like hell I'm letting you get out before me. It turned out that the first obstacle of the race wasn't the bottleneck created by the starting tunnel at all. No, the true hurdle to clear was the ambition and selfishness of the other competitors. Forget being crammed shoulder to shoulder from the start, the pushing and shoving as everyone fought to get to the entrance was nightmare all on its own. How do we get out of this mess? Kyuka shouted over the bedlam, ducking under a stray elbow to look back at the rest of her team. It's worse than some of the mosh pits I've been to. Without looking, Izuku pointed up. The ceiling isn't crowded. The musically quirked teen glanced up, as did the avian and amphibian teens beside her. Fumikage facepalmed. Faster than their eyes could follow, Tsuyu used her powerful legs and leapt onto the wide-open ceiling above. With a gracious smile, the frog girl happily shot out her tongue and wrapped it around Izuku, pulling her boyfriend along with her as she began to crawl forward. Not to be left behind, Fumikage silently called forth Dark Shadow, the quirk entity billowing forth in the dimly lit tunnel. Steeling himself, the avian teen bent down and picked up Kyuka bridal style before the punk rocker could react, and he could second-guess himself. Precious cargo secured, Dark Shadow unsheathed his otherworldly claws and climbed up to the ceiling before following Tsuyu toward the entrance. The weight of its two passengers hardly seemed to slow the quirk entity down a bit. Others, seeing the unconventional tactics four of their competitors were using, began to think of ways to follow the examples shown. Momo wasted no time and created a set of climbing gear, using her newly forged ice axe, rope, and carabiners to move laterally along the wall above the still thrashing mob. Itsuka did much the same, only the martial artist used her quirk-enlarged hands to dig out handholds. The redhead soon found herself racing the ravenette climbing across from her. Shriek! In a flash, the entire floor of the tunnel was suddenly frozen with an inch-thick layer of ice. Todoroki, seeing that four of his classmates had taken the high ground, and inspired others to do so as well, had made his move. Outside the tunnel. And the first to exit the starting line is? Todoroki from Class 1A. The booming voice of Present Mike announced as Todoroki, riding a lance of ice, spearheaded to the front of the competition. Upon reaching the open air, the heterochromatic found his path blocked by a group of monstrously sized robots, each painted with a giant zero-pointer. That's right folks. Present Mike screamed through the loudspeakers, it's Robo Inferno. The numerous titans of iron and steel flickered to life, a multitude of red lenses coming online as their attack parameters were finally met. With only one target visible, the entire lot began to move in towards Todoroki. We told the students to avoid these zero-pointers during the entrance exams practical, Eraserhead's calmer voice took over, a drastic contrast to his spastic companion. But now they won't allow anyone to pass without a fight. It'll be up to each and every student to handle such opposition the best they can. Inside their own press box, none of the roaring crowd could see that while the two pro heroes presented in vastly different styles, both wore serious and had grim expressions. Certain sponsors had always lobbied the board for the sports festival to implement requirements that came down to thinly veiled discriminatory favoritism for as long as either man could remember. They'd experienced it during their own festivals, and had dealt with the fallout as teachers later in life. But this was the first time they knew of that board had capitulated so completely and allowed said sponsors to exert such control, handicapping specific students when the sports festival should be every competitor's time to shine. Eraserhead and Present Mike might have held different beliefs when it came to how to handle children with quirks of a darker nature, but both teachers agreed that the outside interference their students were going to suffer this festival was something that needed to be avoided in the future at all costs. I don't have time for this. Todoroki grunted, his monotone almost rising to that of a shout as he evaded multiple titanic fists from a trio of zero-pointers. The heterochromatic teen had tried to evade the first obstacles of the race and just carry on to his inevitable win, leaving the robotic behemoths to the rest still behind him, but he'd encountered a problem. The mountainous machines turned out to be incredibly stubborn. Zigzagging did nothing to throw them off. Doubling back only allowed them to encroach further toward him. Mild counters to otherwise devastating attacks seemed to have no effect. Scowling, Todoroki weaved his hand through the air as he stopped and stomped his foot at the annoyances still pursuing him. Glacial winds burst into existence and in a split second, the titans of metal, and the entire field around them, was frozen solid. Apparently not satisfied, the dual-colored hero in training stomped again, spikes of ice spearing up from the ground at irregular intervals from his feet to the behemoths. Would you look at that? In an amazing display of power, Todoroki not only defeated the first obstacle, but he also opened up a path for his fellow students. Present mixed-color commentary fired up the awed spectators, the crowd quickly roaring in support of the heterochromatic teen. However, I wouldn't be so quick to hand the kid a medal if I were you. Like a bucket of cold water, Eraserhead's grizzled voice dampened the audience's enthusiasm with confusion just as the rest of the competitors began to arrive at the first official obstacle zone. The underground hero's words appeared almost prophetic, as after only a few steps onto the still frozen field, the newly arrived students were forced to stop as the 0-pointers collectively shook off the icy frost that had clogged their systems. Unfortunately for them, the frost coating the ground and the towering spikes of ice remained, making a difficult situation that much harder to navigate. Todoroki didn't do anyone any favors, Eraserhead clarified into his mic for those still unable to comprehend what was going on. He only intended to clear the obstacle in front of him. If he planned for his method to inconvenience his competition, it'll have to go under review. While the words were spoken in a neutral tone, and the crowd accepted his words easily enough, back inside their press box the underground hero was giving his co-announcer a meaningful look. Silently, both teachers agreed to follow up on this behavior. While it was understandable that in events such as this students were expected to look out for themselves, the way Todoroki had blocked the path for the rest of the competition was in no way heroic. At all. Down on the track, the rest of the students had almost ceased advancing entirely. Robo Inferno had become a combat zone, the 0-pointers releasing their smaller brethren once they'd acknowledged the presence of more targets, and no one could evade both the Titans of Steel while also being harassed by the quick 1- and 2-pointers. Progress seemed only a pipe dream, until a commanding voice rose up above the chaos. "Don't panic. We need to work together if we want to clear a path to the next obstacle." There was a second of silence, nobody moved. Then, as one, every remaining competitor turned to look at who had had the balls to try and take command of a situation meant to showcase individual skill and demand teamwork. Izuku stood, tall and proud, and took the questioning gazes with aplomb. The Verdurette was flanked by his girlfriend and their 2 friends, each stared right back at those examining them with challenge in their eyes. It cut for quite a striking impression. Internally, Izuku was struggling to manhandle his nervousness into submission. His heart felt like it was beating a mile a minute, although he knew cursed blood wouldn't have allowed that. Swallowing his nerves defiantly, the young necromancer stepped forward, keeping a strong visage as all eyes returned to him. "He's right." Itsuka Kendo suddenly agreed, seconding the vice president of 1A's suggestion. "We won't have a chance of advancing at this rate. Working together is the only way right now." The quick support of their big sis easily gained 1B's backing, the normally combative teens scrambling to gather around their leader. Meanwhile, 1A had already edged their way to their second-in-command, even Ojiro, though the tailed teen kept a frown the entire time. And just like that, the cooperation of both heroic classes was all but assured. For now. As the 2 classes came to terms with their temporary truce, the class president of 1B found herself wrestling with her inner thoughts, her emotions a mess. And it was all because of the teen she'd basically just pledged to support through this Robo Inferno. While the rest of her classmates had unanimously agreed not to look into or even think about their failed tests proctors after the fact, Itsuka had struggled through her 2 days of mandatory therapy until her therapist had come up with a solution. To prove to herself that there was no way she or any of her classmates could have beaten their proctors, and gain closure with the events she'd gone through during the test, Dr. Tsunemori had convinced her to do a little research on Osoiek in spite of 1B's promise. It had been all too easy to connect the dots when the redhead didn't feel like she was about to die every other minute. One quick search on the internet had given Itsuka far more information than she'd needed to piece together the truth. She'd been so angry with what she'd found that if she'd had a fire-based quirk the martial artist knew she would have burned her room to ashes. Osoiek. World War I. The Attack of the Dead Men. Each clue led to another, and even if those hadn't been enough, then the number of minions and their names would have been dead enough ringers to figure it out. The proctors had in fact been Izuku Midoriya of Class 1A, his girlfriend Tsuyu Azui, and the Verdurette zombies. Itsuka had no way to confirm her suspicions, or any way whatsoever to even find evidence to support them. But she had found a multi-award-winning essay from back during the entrance exams. The report had centered on what it had meant to be a hero in the era before quirks, touching on the siege of Osoiek as a key example. After binge-reading the entire paper in one go, it had come as a slap in the face when the redhead had read the name of who wrote the piece and found it to be none other than the wielder of the cursed blood. She was ashamed to admit it now, but in the moment, it had taken everything Itsuka had believed it meant to be a hero to keep her from spilling the beans to the rest of her classmates in a bout of petty revenge. Fortunately, Her ideals coupled with the fact the redhead had been able to remember how immature her classmates were had allowed the class president to abort any impulsive actions before it was too late. Class 1B was already in hot water as it was for their previous altercations with the Verdunette, and deep down, Itsuka knew the vice president of 1A had only meant to help them learn an important lesson in the long run. Back in the moment, remembering that 2 students and 3 zombies had obliterated her entire class also helped Itsuka finally cool down and decide that peace was the better part of valor. Seeing that he had the support of the 2 most combat-oriented classes, Izuku moved to put his plan into action. He needed to hurry, the 0-pointers were closing in and the mobs of 1, 2, and 3-pointers were growing in size faster than the other departments could deal with. Momo, prepare a heavy-hitting, long-range weapon. Ida, draw the attention of any 0-pointers that get too close away from Momo. The orders of the young necromancer were quick, crisp, and clear. There was no hesitation on his end. Kaminari. Kirishima. Divide and conquer with the rest of our classmates. We weren't fast enough to keep a majority of the business and support students from being taken out, but now I want you to trash those robots. Tetsu. Shishida. Take a few others with you and back up 1A. Itsuka shouted, doing her best to quickly adapt to the situation. Thinking quickly, the class president did her best to fortify the strategy she could see forming before her. Kamakiri. Pony. You're with me. We're going to protect Yayorozu too. A series of nods and murmured acceptances were given before the combined forces of UA's first-year heroic students moved in tandem to complete their orders. Seeing his plan set, Izuku moved as well, leading Tsuyu, Fumikage, and Kyuka into position. In the comfort of their seats, the general public was beginning to notice that the first obstacle of the obstacle race had become something else. What a development, folks! Present Mike narrated, the pro's own surprise bleeding through his high volume. Instead of competing against one another, IT looks like? Yes, IT looks like both heroics classes have decided to team up. The festival's audience, in the stadium and watching around the world, weren't quite sure how to take the unexpected development. But as usual, the immediate and more vocal responses were from those who spoke first before thinking too hard. Really? Can't they do anything on their own? That ice boy was way better. Just goes to show that weaklings need to join forces if they want to achieve anything. The criticisms of those blinded by the flashiness of the world of heroes flowed unending, each and every one born from a fool who was too quick to judge. However, the seasoned heroes, the real veterans of the field, who'd survived the reality of the streets, watched on and appreciated the brilliance of the 2 first years taking command. These select pros knew that, out there in the field, teamwork was the true cornerstone of victory. If not a part of a team themselves, even the solo heroes knew that they needed assistance on the daily to succeed at their work. Police worked in every capacity outside the actual hero work, licensed navigators led them through the local urban jungles, hell, there was a whole business built around support. That kid is an awfully good leader, Nianta purred, the diminutive supervisor also appreciating the leadership displayed by the target he was ordered to keep an eye on. If he can keep a level head in a situation like this, imagine what he could do in the future. While the senior QRA agent was singing praise, the pro-hero Endeavor watched on in disdain. What the hell is this? Raged the flame hero in his mind, the fire covering his body reflecting his violent emotion. My masterpiece continuing to refuse its full capabilities is bad enough, but my new target also keeping its true power under wraps. Unacceptable. Back down on the track, what had once been a chaotic battlefield now had order and cooperation reign supreme. The students of Class A had fallen in line with Izuku's orders because even those who disliked the cinnamon roll couldn't deny his intelligence and talent for tactics. Their sister class, 1B, had obeyed Itsuka more because they trusted their big sis more than anything else. It was the natural thing to do. Even the few surviving members of the business and support courses, who'd missed or resisted following the commanding voices of the 2 hero students, wisely decided not to get in the way of those working together against the robotic horde. Bang! An unusually loud gunshot suddenly tore through the cacophony of battle. Boom! The following explosion came from a 0-pointer, the titan of steel and circuits toppling as it seemed to be ripped apart. Many stopped completely, too shocked to do anything else other than stare in awe at the destructive force they'd just witnessed. As the slain Goliath finished its collapse, the silent observers turned to search for the source of such power. Their gazes found a grinning Momo, the mature young woman now holding a massive rifle-like weapon in her hands, its stock planted in the ground between her long legs. Izuku-kun was right, Momo said, pulling the lever of the monstrosity she'd created, expelling the used shell from its barrel. The Ravenet took aim at another 0-pointer, the mechanical giant seeming to hesitate as its programming recognized the threat pointed at it. Guns are fun. Bang. Boom. Momo Yaoyorozu had received her own quirk analysis only a few short days ago, 6 to be exact. The notebook entries Izuku had shown her had included so much useful information and thought-provoking ideas that the mature young woman had grabbed the Verdunette up into a hug without thinking. She'd even been able to ignore the death glare sent her way from Tsuchan, who'd she'd just hugged afterwards too. In his notes, Izuku had brought to Momo's attention a glaring weakness the creation user had grown complacent with, her slow generation speed. According to the young necromancer, the limitation had actually come as a result of her rigid thought processes, her creations being exact copies of items she'd previously studied the main problem. For simple creations, like melee weapons, this wasn't too much of an issue, as it ensured the build came out sturdy enough for its purpose. However, for more advanced and/or complex designs, exact replication meant more time for a perfect replication. Momo had read the description of herself with pride, until Izuku had flat out called it a waste of time. The following pages had held extensive notes on how to cut corners, forego complexity, and substitute simplified systems where possible. There'd even been a hypothesis that she could entirely replace the material of a design she'd studied with something else if she memorized suitable alternatives. The mature young woman compartmentalized all of those wandering thoughts and yanked back on the bolt-action lever of her massive rifle. The resounding click of the next and final round of ammo loading into its chamber made the Ravenette's grin turn truly predatory. There was no need for a scope, iron sights enough for such a large target. Bang! Boom! The hybrid weapon she currently held was the end result of hours of study after taking her vice president's analysis to heart. The rifle only required a cannon's barrel, a loader, a trigger, iron sights. The stock was actually just a reinforced structure sunk into the ground to withstand the firepower of her creation. Straddling the weapon kept Momo from having to waste time on creating a recoil compensator or even worry about a shoulder cushion. In fact, the hardest pieces to create had been the heavy payload explosive bullets. Many would agree that the self-satisfied smile the Ravenette gave was terrifying. She didn't care though, she was too busy remembering how the monstrous gun had taken less time to create than a rudimentary cannon had once taken her. Why do I feel like I created a monster? Izuku asked to no one in particular. Deadpan stares greeted the Verdunette from his girlfriend and 2 friends. Anyway, now we can. The young necromancer was interrupted as a stampede of students nearly trampled him. The moment the last 0-pointer fell, the hearts of the competitors immediately fell to the craze once more. The truce was over, and it was every man and woman for themselves. So much for working together, Kyuka snarked, the punk rocker stepping around a few more desperate students. Shouldn't we get going too? The question was directed at the de facto leader of the group of 4, but unfortunately he seemed distracted. Izuku was staring at the remains of the destroyed robots, only, it wasn't his own eyes looking out at the scrap and slag. The few parts still intact were beginning to look like the pieces of something else to the Verdunette. Knowledge he'd never had before, of the inner workings of robotics, flowed like expectant whispers into his ears. The hero in training felt his hands twitch, suddenly eager as if they knew just how to move to turn the junk before him into something new. The young necromancer looked down at his hands, then back to the wreckage, then back to his hands. A tug in the back of his mind finally connected the last dot for him. He was looking at the world with Saki's eyes. My friend? Fumikage questioned, the avian teen somehow sensing something had happened. Has your darkness begun to rebel against your soul? The raven-headed hero in training got his answer when Izuku turned to look at his 3 teammates and stared at them with eyes of glowing ruby. I have a plan. Izuku stated, sounding just slightly more wild than normal. Let's fuck everything up. While Fumikage and Kyuka shared confused glances, Tsuyu turned to look back at the seating area where she knew the zombie girls to be. Izuku had told the frog girl that he suspected the bond he shared with his partners worked both ways. Saki had already confessed that she had experienced a bit of a brain boost lately, so it stood to reason that he would somehow benefit from the blonde delinquent's expertise where machinery was concerned. Meanwhile, at the front of the race, and after acing the pit, Todoroki has finally been brought to a halt by the 3rd and final obstacle. Present mix announcement was a tad redundant, but did little to highlight the heterochromatic's true predicament. After creating an ice bridge fragile enough to collapse after he passed over the massive second obstacle, the dual-colored teen had found himself in a truly disadvantageous position. Using his ice would make things quick, but even if he thawed it afterwards, the mines he'd have covered would most likely still be deactivated. Shoto didn't want to leave a clear path for any of the competition behind him. While the mines are obviously non-lethal, they still pack a punch. If Todoroki lets himself get hit, it'll surely slow him down long enough for the others to catch up. The solution here may be obvious to him, But will he accept the repercussions? Eraserhead's grave voice was enough to push Todoroki into action. The heterochromatic decided he'd take slow and steady over giving anyone else an advantage. It wasn't like he hadn't put enough distance between himself and the competition anyway. And the rest of the students begin to hit the pit. Present Mix announcement directed the public to the chasm that made up the second obstacle, where rock pillars stood as makeshift platforms across the gaping wound in the earth. Everything from pipes to cables, and even sometimes thick rope, connected various pillars, bridges for those without the ability to fly. Unexpected teamwork overcame the first obstacle, but this time there's little room for hand-holding. Eraserhead's words rang true for many, and students who'd only just worked together against a robotic horde from hell steeled themselves to face off against their friends. None could see a way to use each other's strengths here. It's time for my babies to shine. May Hatsum screamed as she dashed right by the stymied competition and off the edge into the pit. With the click of a button, the inventor's boots flared to life, and the hover tech she'd built into the clunky footwear increased the Pinkette's speed and jumping ability tenfold. It wasn't enough. The next closest platform was still too far away. And after a good jumpstart, May continued, smiling widely as she knew her move had caught the eye of a majority of the crowd, a crowd that the representatives of major support companies were currently a part of. Everyone would be looking at her, the support student who dared to challenge the hero courses. My grappling babies will do the rest. From the Pinkette's belt, two gun-like gadgets poked out and fired grappling hooks. The projectiles rocketed towards the pillar, digging deeply into the stony earth. Secured, May braced for impact and allowed her hover boots to take the brunt of the collision. Flipping a switch, the mad inventor's grappling hooks began to reel in, carrying their creator up to the top of the platform faster than many could follow. Envy flared in many of the competitors as they watched such a daring move. Having such gadgets would have been a godsend for them. I can do this. I can. Ida muttered to himself as he examined the task at hand. He knew he could pull this off, but he'd have to sacrifice speed if he wanted to keep proper balance along the pipeline he'd selected. It would be unsightly, but his plan would be a fair bit safer than recklessly trying to jump from platform to platform. He needed to keep his engines in the green for the next events anyway. Suddenly, Ida felt a familiar weight settle onto his back. Let's join forces, Tenyakuin. Uraraka cheered as she climbed the stern speedster like a squirrel for a piggyback ride. I just bet we could fly together. Without waiting for Ida's answer, the brunette brushed a hand against the bespectacled teen's cheek, activating her quirk. Now weightless, Ida realized Ochiko was the only thing keeping him earthbound, which was actually perfect. Many wouldn't know it by looking at him, but the speedster was in reality a fairly heavy guy, his engines and his body's natural quirk adaptation for denser muscles and bones not doing him any favors in that department. Only having to carry the brunette's mass would allow him to move at incredible speeds for relatively little wear and tear. However, the sensation of flight had come for an entirely different reason. Of course. Hold fast, Ochiko-chan. Tenya shouted, revving his engines as he got into a runner's start position. Together we can fly. With the massive reduction in weight without the sacrifice of any power, Ida flew through the air like a skipping stone, bouncing from one platform to another with barely any effort. In fact, the hardest part for the speedster was hiding his blush. Essentially being tightly hugged by the girl he was dating, in public, made concentration difficult. Not impossible, just harder than he'd expected. And calling it dating might have been a bit of an exaggeration. When he'd brought up the fact that he'd shared a number of meals and one-on-one chats with the anti-gravity girl to his big brother Tensei, the pro-hero had been all too quick to label such outings as dates. The elder speedster had been proud that his little brother had been starting to mature and loosen up. Of course, denials had flown vehemently in response, but it hadn't mattered in the end. When Tensei had suggested he try to ask Ochiko out on an actual date, Ida hadn't been able to come up with a logical excuse not to. On her side of things, Ochiko had been understandably surprised when the boy who'd become her shoulder to cry on had suddenly made such a proposition, and she'd been quite reticent to accept as well. She might have thought about approaching Izuku for a life of plentiful money once upon a time, but it would have been money the two could have earned together through hard work and determination. Accepting Tenya threw that out the window, as the money was already there, and she would no doubt be labeled as a gold digger regardless of her intentions. Even so, the brunette had still been interested. After an afternoon full of chatting over tea and mocha, the two teens had finally decided to call their outings training dates instead of the real thing. Both had discovered a desire to practice dating for if, and when, they eventually found the right person while at the same time keeping their families happy and not cause any problems for their school life. So that is what they'd agreed on. And if they found that they were that right person for each other along the way? Well, that would be just fine too. What the? Cheaters. The cries and shouts from their competitors did little to stop the glide-skipping couple. In no time at all, the two found themselves hitting solid ground on the other side of the chasm. Taking a moment to look back, the duo couldn't help but grin at the still struggling students they'd left behind. There's no cheating in teamwork. Being able to synergize strengths in the field is an invaluable skill for any hero in the field. Hearing their homeroom teacher validate their tactic filled Ida with elation. Engraving the rare praise in his heart, the speedster ensured Uraraka was still well secured on his back. The brunette had to bite her lip as she nearly yelped in surprise at the reaffirmed grip of her partner. She'd expected him to put her down once they'd cleared the second obstacle, so they could continue on their own. It warmed her heart to know she meant that much to him. The duo could hardly get 2 steps, however, before they were faced with the sad truth of the universe. There is always someone better. And here comes the embodiment of teamwork. Working with 3 other competitors, the monster of UA is making an unbelievable comeback. Mike, we do not call our students monsters. Eraserhead's reprimand did little to avert the attention of the public, now fixated on a new exciting development. It was like something out of a bad post-apocalyptic movie. Speeding along the track, on a direct course for the chasm of the pit, Izuku, Tsuyu, Kyuka, and Fumikage rode on what could only be described as the nightmarish lovechild of steampunk and a hovercraft. Built from the shielding of a couple of 2-pointers, kept together by foraged wiring and reinforced cabling, and powered by the boosters, rockets, and thrusters from various robot types, the vehicle was as crude-looking as it was effective. Izuku and Tsuyu had the cabling wrapped around their arms, the two working in concert to keep their craft together. Fumikage had Dark Shadow act as a 2-in-1 steering wheel and rudder, the quirk entity taking no damage from dragging its arms along the ground. Kyuka put her focus into fueling the numerous boosters and thrusters with her quirk, powering the craft with her thundering heartbeat. There's the pit. Dead ahead. Izuku shouted to his crew. Fumikage, get ready to have Dark Shadow spread his wings. Kyuka, I need you to dig deep and go beyond. Aye. The two replied as one, enjoying the chaos of the wild ride their friend had gotten them into, and all the trouble they were causing by breaking all expectations. When the hovercraft reached the edge of the pit, Kyuka clenched her eyes tight, reached out, and grabbed Fumicage's hand. With a sudden jerk, the propulsion system kicked into high gear and the jerry-rigged ship began to take off. Clearing the edge, wings of solid shadow spread wide, catching the air underneath. Against all odds, the hovercraft remained airborne, gliding over the canyon with ease like a bird of prey. Ida and Uraraka could only watch as the crude vehicle flew over the entire chasm with 4 passengers aboard and landed with the barest minimum of grace to keep a straight line. Woha! The raucous scream of joy from their punk rock classmate snapped the two from their stupor. Quickly! Uraraka shouted, bopping Ida on the head in panic. The blows were hardly felt by the now enraged speedster. We can't let them be faster than us. Back at the front of the race? Shoto Todoroki was halfway through the minefield. So far, his strategy had paid off. The only students anywhere near him were those who had some ability to fly. And of course, those who had been able had used up most of their stamina crossing the chasm, leaving them too tired now to want to risk speeding forward and stepping on a mine. The rest? The heterochromatic would have been surprised if anyone else would cross the pit before he crossed the finish line and obtained his goal of first place. Boom! An exploding mine grabbed the dual quirk-wielding teen attention, bringing back to the task at hand. So some fool had tried their luck and failed? Oh well. Boom! 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 The cascading eruptions forced Todoroki to turn around. Mismatched eyes widened in muted surprise. It was the team that was turning this entire competition inside out. Their craft was activating mines as it sped over the field, but instead of falling apart, the contraption was somehow fast enough to clear the blast radius of each mine it set off before the blast could affect its trajectory. And it was approaching him fast. Too fast. And worse yet, the damnable thing was clearing a path for the rest of the students to bum rush behind it. Todoroki frowned, but realized quickly he had no other option if he wanted to secure his place at first. Stomping hard, the heterochromatic froze the ground around him, shooting a path of ice forward thick enough to disable every mine in front of him. Picking up speed, it took only a few seconds for the mouth of the tunnel back into the stadium to come into view. The final stretch. Boom! VRRRM. So long. Todoroki snapped his head to the right, shocked that the strange craft had caught up to him so soon. The sound girl, Jiro, was leaning over the side and waving smugly. Sucker. Looking back, the son of Endeavor would realize it wouldn't be that light insult that would cause him to react. No, it would be catching sight of Midoriya's face over the punk rocker's shoulder that would ignite a burning desire to win in his stomach. Midoriya, the Emerald Necromancer, the monster of UA, would be smiling. The wide grin would be that of a winner, one savoring a victory but also enjoying the competition along the way. Overwhelmed with emotions he couldn't place or name, Todoroki would take a step too hard, push too far, and the ice that would race from his right side would spear outward like Lancer's blade. The unintentional construct would clip Midoriya's craft and the four teens, not expecting the move, would be flung from their spiraling creation. Crash! Gah! The quartet of friends screamed in surprise as they instinctively tucked and rolled after they were flung from their hovercraft. Scrambling to their feet, the four would realize they were thankfully unharmed, only to wince as their creation flipped one final time before colliding with the side of the stadium. Boom! Staring uncomprehendingly at the fireball that had been their ride, the four friends only just managed to catch sight of Todoroki as he passed them by, still running at full speed. Izuku clenched his fists as he stared after the heterochromatic, the verdant never before having felt the need to punch someone so hard before. His friends could have been hurt by that stunt. Oh! It seems Endeavor's son makes a last-second move, and takes back first place. Using his quirk to sabotage the competition was clearly stated as being against the rules before the first event began. Such an act will come with a penalty. Izuku shook his head, somewhat mollified that Todoroki would face repercussions for his actions. Turning, the young necromancer was about to ask his friends and girlfriend if they were all right, when his entire world went dark. Dark shadow rose up, enlarged hand and arm lifting Izuku up into the air. Below, Fumicage's avian features were pulled tight as the dark teen allowed his raging emotions to strengthen his sentient quirk. You shall not. Fumicage roared, rearing back his arm as if to throw a baseball, an act that Dark Shadow mimicked, steal my friend's victory. Fumicage swung, and Dark Shadow pitched. And just like that, Izuku was launched through the air at inhuman speed straight for the mouth of the stadium's final tunnel. Todoroki could only blink as a green missile shot by, landed a handful of meters in front of him, unfurling into Midoriya, and immediately took off after gracefully transitioning into a full-on sprint. The heterochromatic teen snapped out of his daze and redoubled his efforts. He had to gain more speed. He needed to surpass the competition, be the best. But he couldn't. The final 300 meters were torture, a test of every ounce of years of physical training and suffering under the hand of the bastard who'd hurt his mother. His leg muscles ached, feeling like lead. His lungs burned, hardly able to keep the oxygen flowing. And through it all, Midoriya just kept that optimal speed he'd had after being thrown. Close, but unreachable. And then, the race was over. Bursting through the tunnel, reality set in as the lights of the stadium lit the world. Shoto Todoroki, son of the number 2 hero, had finished the first round of the sports festival in second place. The ensuing celebrations, especially the one between Midoriya and his friends, didn't even register in the mind of the troubled teen. Midnight's words of stunned praise to the verdant hardly reached his ears. All Todoroki could see was a wall that had risen up to block his way to the top. A wall he would need to overcome. Omake, Momo's woes. Momo Yaoyorozu, class president of UA's Hero Class 1A, slammed into the school's third-floor girls' bathroom running full tilt, barely making it in time to an empty stall before vomiting up whatever was in her stomach. Ugh! The Ravenette groaned, fighting her stomach's urge to turn inside out yet again thanks to the aftertaste in her mouth, and the smell. Why did I forget that? Momo's current woe was the result of accidentally walking into a most gruesome scene. Had taken to cause massive widespread damage at the USJ. Right after their post-trauma test that proved she and her classmates were ready to continue with their studies, Aizawa-sensei had announced that after conversing with Izuku-kun, he'd be utilizing Sweet Lily and her quirk to strengthen the class. It turned out the adorable little girl possessed a quirk, Dissonant Song, which could take down any emitter type if used long enough. 5 seconds was all it had taken to cause massive widespread damage at the USJ. However, there was a problem with Lily using her quirk. The power of Dissonant Song was too much for the poor girl's vocal cords, and actually hurt the Blueonette with each song. Luckily, with Izuku-kun there, the wounds could be healed relatively quickly. Still, mindful of causing undue suffering, Aizawa-sensei had limited the training to once-a-week exercises. Each exercise would consist of being exposed to a single second of Dear Lily's quirk and then attempt to continue working on whatever task Aizawa-sensei would think to put them through at that moment. Emitters would have it the worst, and transformers would get sick, but the mature class president had understood the necessity of learning to work through pain and disorientation. Disruptor quirks weren't that uncommon. To neglect developing a resistance to such abilities wasn't logical. However, much to her shame, Momo had been brought to her knees during that day's exercise. Even a second of Dissonant Song had sent her head spinning and weakened her entire body. That wasn't what had brought the class president to this moment over the porcelain throne though. Urgh. Why can't I just forget it? Momo asked the dirted toilet water she was staring into. That sensation, that taste, why is it still there? After recovering from the exercise, Momo had wanted to cuddle with her little sister, the bundle of joy and merriment surely needing some love and reassurance that her quirk was being used to better 1A and she was an angel for sticking it through and helping them get stronger. When she'd eventually found the blueonette however, Momo had found the little girl sitting in Izuku-kun's lap, gleefully licking at the verdunette's bleeding hand. Just thinking of the scene almost caused the mature young woman to vomit again. Not for the first time, Momo cursed as her mind was cast back to the past, to the exact moment that had given her the hemophobia that plagued her. Flashback. She'd been just 7 years old when she'd been invited by her father to learn dinner etiquette one night. It was tedious, but a needed lesson for the heiress of their family and company. Business meals were important ventures after all. Tonight we start with the basics, the Yaoyorozu patriarch had said softly, easing his little princess into things. We'll focus on silverware and manners first, before moving on. Momo had meant to merely nod and take her lesson silently. Even at a young age, the Ravenette had always been like that, capable of fully focusing on learning without a single objection. It was something her parents had come to regret only a day previously. A tutor the elder Yaoyorozu had hired had gone a little too advanced, a little too soon. High intelligence was all well and good, and advanced lessons were obviously required to foster such a brilliant mind, but teaching a child about menstruation, in graphic detail no less, was unacceptable. The woman had been removed immediately, but the damage had been done. Little Momo had the knowledge of what awaited her in womanhood seared into her young mind. Understandably, she'd been beyond disturbed and unsettled. Father? Momo had called, instead of merely nodding. I know today's lesson is not about enjoying the food, but, may I ask to share your favorite dish? Thinking for a second, the Yaoyorozu patriarch had considered the request. He could see no problem with getting a little more father-daughter time in while continuing the lesson. I don't see why not. Momo's father had said easily with a smile, but could I ask why? Young Momo had nodded enthusiastically, happy she was being allowed her request. You always seem to enjoy it with great gusto, Momo had eventually replied, a sparkle in her eyes. I merely wish to share that experience with you. Her father had chuckled, enamored with his daughter's manners and honest eyes. The Yaoyorozu patriarch motioned for the servant to come over, and gave the man the addition to the planned meal. A cut of medium-rare steak. With grape juice instead of wine of course. The lesson had continued on as intended. Little Momo had correctly identified each piece of silverware after only a little coaching, and had selected the proper instrument for each course of the meal. She'd even shown above-expected skill in handling the various forks, knives, and spoons. The young Ravenette had then focused on mimicking her father's movements while eating, taking to heart the way the man's focus never wavered from his imaginary companion. The Yaoyorozu patriarch could eat his meal and hardly look at the food before him for more than a single second. So focused on emulating her father was she, that little Momo didn't notice when her steak was placed before her, or that the meat was, as its nature intended, still red in the middle. When the 7-year-old had placed a piece of the steak in her mouth, an unknown, unexpectedly ferric taste had invaded her taste buds. A nearly viscous texture had then met her tongue as she'd prodded the strange thing she'd taken a bit of. A reddish liquid spilled from her mouth, and when she'd looked at the handkerchief she'd used to wipe up the offending fluid, she'd screamed. Somehow, someway, little Momo's mind linked the crimson liquid staining the handkerchief with the red that had filled the lesson her ex-tutor had given her the day before. All the Ravenette had known at that moment was that she'd somehow started to bleed, and the fear of blood that had been sown during the previous day blossomed. End of flashback. I really love my Lily-chan. Momo murmured to herself as she left the bathroom, but I really need to remember to refrain from being present when she needs to eat. Momo nearly retched again, but managed to swallow it down through sheer force of will. Now she really needed to cuddle with the little idol, and it would surely heal both of them. A sinister harmony. Reiko Amabuki, third in command of the street gang known as Doremi, watched the UA Sports Festival's first event with a manic grin splitting her face. Along with a large group of her friends, fellow gang members, and customers, the Violet was enjoying the nationwide entertainment wholeheartedly while chilling under the shade of a pavilion. The overboss is. Reiko began, taking in the instant replays as the featured back-to-back of the moment a certain Verdunette came from behind and stole first place in the obstacle race, an absolute badass. As the widescreen TV everyone had gathered around cut to commercial, Reiko took a moment to process what they'd just seen, and think back to everything that had happened to her and the gang recently. When Saki had first returned from the dead, As a super badass zombie no less, she and the rest of the girls had been ecstatic. Then the restored boss had presented the guy that had brought her back. Needless to say, the gang hadn't been impressed. What they'd seen was a string bean, a mama's boy, a goody two-shoes too meek to deserve to command their gang, let alone their undead boss. While grateful to the Verdunette for bringing Saki back to them, the girls had impulsively decided in seconds that the freckled teen wouldn't be accepted into their ranks. And really, he was just a boy. How worthless would he have been in an all-female crew? But then Saki had lit up like a firecracker and nearly busted their eardrums with her indignant roaring. It hadn't taken long for the blonde to make it incredibly clear that it wasn't up to the gang to decide whether or not the Verdunette joined. That hadn't even been the point of him visiting at all. As it turned out, the cute mama's boy, the string bean with nice manners and a gentle smile? He was an honest-to-God necromancer. And according to Saki, her new boss hadn't needed a bunch of worthless, lazy bitches at his command. Having easily retaken the reins of Doremi, the blonde firecracker had then laid down her ultimatum: if anyone wanted to stay in the gang, if they wanted their family to survive, then they needed to put in the effort and work. It had been an easy decision for the girls to make. In the end, the first part of the work itself had sounded absurdly easy, keeping an eye on their new overboss's dear mother, and keeping her safe, while maintaining a distance to prevent unfounded worry. The girls of Doremi had quickly discovered, however, that Inko Midoriya attracted quite a bit of trouble all on her own without even trying. 2 muggers, a suspiciously well-dressed stalker, and even some blonde freak wearing some kind of old-school plague mask, each had to be intercepted and successfully intimidated to leaving their charge alone. Those the girls could handle. But that ashen blonde woman? She nearly caused them to fail their mission 5 times in just 2 days. And then Mrs. Midoriya had been hospitalized. The girls had taken that extremely hard. Even though it had nothing to do with them, they still felt like they'd failed. Reiko-ne. The sudden call snapped Doremi's acting leader from her thoughts. Looking over, the older teen raked a hand through the neon stripes of blue and red in her hair as she took in the tense face of a subordinate sister as she walked up. The violet's calm visage did nothing to dispel the air of danger growing around her. "We've got some trouble," the younger girl announced when she was finally within distance to not have to shout. "Police?" Reiko asked, raising an eyebrow. The simple action caused the messenger to flinch. "And no," the brunette hesitantly answered, "just some assholes that are demanding a discount and won't go away when we tell them no." Reiko frowned, pissed off in an instant. Who the hell did these bozos think they were? Did they not know where the fuck they were? This was Dagoba Beach. And it was theirs. It had come as a surprise, but instead of reprimanding the girls for their perceived failure, the Monday following Mrs. Midoriya's admittance to the hospital, their new overboss had gathered them up and sat them down. In a speech that was entirely too cute and heartwarming, the Emerald Necromancer had accepted them as capable of being his gang, and then had proceeded to reward them with a prize that had blown their minds. Dagoba Municipal Beach Park was no longer public. Somehow, someway, the sandy junkyard dump had become his property. And he'd awarded it to them as Doremi's own turf. The girls had been understandably flabbergasted. And to make the feat even more ludicrously impressive, the entire act had been legal, backed by a legitimization from the police for services rendered. The real kicker though had to have been the revelation that as long as the girls kept the beach clean, and didn't commit any felonies like murder, rape, or drug dealing, then they were free to do whatever they wanted inside the bounds of the park. Their turf. In an instant, Doremi had gone from functionally homeless to having their own turf, and a large one at that. There would be no more filthy alleys, no more condemned buildings about to collapse for them. They wouldn't have to share space with other gangs, delinquents, or other lowlifes and constantly be on guard. It was theirs, and even the police walked their beats and drove their runs without giving them a second glance. So blinded by the euphoria of finally having turf to call their own, the members of Doremi had tackled the Herculean task of cleaning the beach with wild abandon. Under orders from their overboss though, the girls did eventually have to calm down enough to be able to separate the piles of trash and junk into waste and recyclables. Procuring a dump truck was easy enough for the actual trash they found, and what could be salvaged or recycled was dismantled, repurposed, or thrown into the correctly labeled bins. In under a week's time, Doremi had succeeded in cleaning Dagoba spotless, built some shacks to crash in, and had even laid down the foundations for a proper track to bike race on. While the girls had celebrated, the overboss had revealed his real master plan. Like a true bancho, the verdant necromancer hadn't been about to let his subordinates sit on their asses like chumps. They had to earn their keep. And that meant money. Heading off any worries about becoming a second Akayan before they could even be voiced, their overboss had ordered the girls to open Dagoba to the public, for a price. After paying a modest fee, individuals, couples, even families could enter and enjoy the beach like normal. Food and drink could also be bought for an additional fee. And if anyone didn't like it, they could step off and get the fuck out. Being the kind and generous overboss he was, the necromancer had even given the girls free rein to decide the scope of fees, rules, and penalties alike. Anyone caught using his beach as their own personal dumpster would receive no mercy. Unless they're police, there's no discount, Reiko responded flatly, getting a mock salute from the brunette. You know the rules. Unfortunately, the new arrivals hadn't felt like waiting at the gate for permission to enter. You can't charge us to use a public beach. A rather fat man shouted, sounding slightly out of breath as he trudged toward the pavilion from the public entrance. The two others who'd followed the trespasser were quick to agree. We have a right to be here just like anyone else. You want us to call the police? At the threat of police, a woman stretched out on a beach chaise close by Reiko turned and lowered her sunglasses to take in the unfolding scene. You want me to deal with this? The woman asked the Violet kindly, gently patting the police cap sitting under her. I am an officer after all. The third in command of the Dorami gang shook her head, eyeing the trio of idiots approaching them. Nah, I can deal with these asshats myself, the delinquent replied, standing from the beach chair she'd been sitting in. Turning her back on the television that was still running commercials, Reiko gave a bloodthirsty grin. I've been itching for a fight anyway. I can't afford to look weak after the overboss just showed us such badassery. Reaching over to dig into her purse, the Violet pulled out her trusted length of thick, industrial-strength chain. What? She never left home without it. And someone's gotta teach these shit-eating pigs to learn their place. As she spoke, Reiko drew her hands to the ends of the chain, starting from the middle. As the Violet's hands passed each link, the metal bands were set ablaze. And that's either out of here or as meat in a burger. The officer slipped her sunglasses back on, turned back to the widescreen television, and took a sip of her cold beverage while pointedly ignoring whatever was about to happen. After all, once you witnessed a zombie you'd first seen in a cabin of all places unleash an unholy amount of violence in one of the highest courtrooms in Japan, what were the screams of horror and panic from a couple of entitled jackasses? She was off duty anyway. Unassuming upscale apartment, too close to a Cayenne. Sitting on an extremely comfortable couch, a black-haired man of a rather unremarkably bland appearance enjoyed the first of his 2 days of paid leave. He'd earned this recent length of respite thanks to his own hard work and the help of a certain Verdunette. Of course, with today being the opening of UA's sports festival, and the day the first years performed, there was only one thing on the enormous television mounted on the wall in front of him. That boy Midoriya. Naomasa Tsukachi cheered joyfully as he watched the young hero in training he'd gotten to know so well cross the finish line in first place for the obstacle race. Maybe that'll teach those idiots that it's not just the quirk that counts. Far away from the expectations and restrictions of his job and peers, Naomasa was finally able to fully relax and be himself, express his feelings and desires without fear of repercussion. One such feeling was the man's appreciation for the young Midoriya. If he were a jealous man, the off-duty detective knew he'd be envious of the Verdunette's mother for having such a great kid. Another benefit of being on vacation Naomasa loved to enjoy? He could trapeze around in nothing but his boxers and no one would complain. Oh my, purred a seductive and feminine voice with an unseen grin from behind the off-duty detective. A pair of flawlessly sexy arms wrapped around his shoulders from the back of the couch. Tell us how you really feel, Masasama. Silky caramel locks still free from their customary heart-shaped knot delicately fell around the left side of Naomasa's head as the owner of the voice rested her head on his broad shoulder. Without hesitation, the off-duty took a deep breath, inhaling the irresistible scent of pleasure that emanated from the waves of chestnut hair. Naomasa started, pausing a moment to appreciate Midoriya celebrating while surrounded by his close friends, has the markings of a true hero in the making. The kind of hero I'd always wanted to be. The head on his shoulder and its aromatic hair retreated, leaving the off-duty detective with a distinct feeling of loneliness. Quiet steps assuaged his soul, however, as the woman who just teased him moved from her spot to circle the couch, revealing she was only wearing a bathrobe, his, and maybe the lower half of a pair of lingerie. Sensually swaying her hips, the fragrant woman glided forward until she was in front of Naomasa, before giggling as she gracefully sat herself on his lap, straddling the man. But you are a hero, Masasama, the woman said playfully as she leaned into her seat's bare chest, caressing the familiar muscles she found there. Strong arms came up to wrap around her slender figure. You're my hero. The declaration was quickly followed by a kiss, which quickly escalated as both participants basked in the other's warmth and scent. I love you, the woman declared tenderly as the two pulled away, desperate for oxygen, my Masasama. And I love you too, Naomasa returned, matching the love and one he saw in the chocolate eyes gazing up at him, Yujiri. Time stopped, suspended by the raw emotion flowing around, through, and between the two lovers. Nothing else existed for them except the other. Suddenly, Naomasa tightened his grip on the beautiful woman in his arms, his face turning serious. "Yuheim, please, we can stop pretending." The off-duty detective's voice started strong, yet wavered near the end. He brought up a hand to caress a rosy cheek of his beloved. "Let's get Mar." A single, delicate finger snapped out and planted itself on Naomasa's lips. "Don't. I can't." "Why, you know we can't," Yujiri replied, looking down in abject regret. There was not an ounce of true rejection in those spoken words, only sorrow. Naomasa felt a tear drip onto his chest. "The world needs men like you, and no one would trust a detective who was married to a whore." Yujiri took a deep breath, centered her breaking emotions, and looked back into the eyes of the man who owned her heart. She ignored his disapproving frown at her self-abusive description. It was the truth as far as she saw it. There was no evidence the experienced Naomasa could see that his beloved had just been on the cusp of crying. "Besides, someone needs to care for the garden," the beautiful brunette continued, pushing away the duo's dreams with the cold hand of pragmatism. "Those girls need the guidance of the only mother figure they know that truly loves them, and the protection of the only father they could ever trust." Feeling an odd mix of melancholy and pride, Naomasa dropped the subject. His beloved was right, as usual. The man known as Naomasa Tsukachi wasn't just a top detective. He was also a liaison between the UN and Japan, the Hero Association and the police force, and an invisible sentinel that helped those downtrodden by society to receive justice. And she was no whore, damn it. She was the mistress of a questionably legal establishment that provided arranged dates and companions for people of any and all social levels, a collector of broken girls who'd been abandoned, abused, or discarded. She took these young women in, transformed them, educated them, healed them, turned them into forces of nature that could take the reins of the lives into their own hands and move on. She was also the police force's best informant this side of Tokyo. It wasn't a perfect system by any means, but whenever Naomasa was involved in certain cases and ended up finding young girls or women in certain situations, he'd offer to take them away. Almost everyone had accepted. In fact, the off-duty detective was the one who'd brought most of the girls currently working at the garden to Yujiri. Unfortunately, the healing process was never as cut and dry as one hoped. It took years for many of the girls to get a handle on what they'd been through, let alone overcome their traumas, and oftentimes they grew too old for orphanages or conventional adoption by the time they were ready to return to society at large. Which was, of course, just fine too. Yujiri would never turn out one of her girls, bearing truly heinous behavior, back into the dark underbelly of society. This led to many staying on at the garden permanently, or as permanently as they wanted it to be until they decided they were ready to move on. The girls all ended up loving their mother, the madam, mistress, or whatever other name they'd come up with to describe the woman who'd taken in so completely. And all of them saw him as their savior too, the only man they'd ever been able to rely on, to trust. They called him Papa, and Naomasa wouldn't ever lie and say that didn't warm him to the bottom of his heart. "Look, Masa-sama," Yujiri whispered gently into Naomasa's ear, breaking him from his introspection with a shiver, "the next event is about to start." Without warning, Yujiri shifted lasciviously atop the off-duty detective's lap until she was facing the television. Leaning back, the beautiful brunette rested against Naomasa's solid chest, grinning mischievously as she felt something else solid become trapped between her thighs. Naomasa swallowed thickly as he realized his hard-on had just been discovered. He'd been doing so well at keeping it hidden this time too. Still facing away from him, Yujiri straightened her legs and stood up. "Let's see what else young Midoriya can do, yes?" Caramel locks brushed Naomasa's nose, and out of habit he took a deep breath. Immediately the off-duty detective let that breath explode out in a wordless grunt as he felt the woman who held his heart elegantly grab his manhood, tease her lingerie to the side, and impale herself upon him as she sat back down. "Ah? Make sure you pay attention, my Masa-sama. Tight. Thrill. Warm. Home. Sparks. Wet. Love." Naomasa could hardly concentrate enough to string more than two words together, his mind and body rebelling in the face of the absolute pleasure his beloved was sharing with him. A stream of electric fire was shooting up and down his spine and through his limbs, his very being curling around the center of his world. The gasps he'd caught from the woman in his arms was all the off-duty detective needed to know Yujiri was feeling just as good, if not even better, than he was. Hips instinctively jerking in sync, the two lovers gasped and groaned, pressing as tightly together as possible. Naomasa nodded belatedly, agreeing with whatever his beloved had said as he reached out and engulfed the woman in his arms. One hand rose up, grasping and fondling Yujiri's large breasts in equal measure. The other adventured down, found the button atop where they were connected, and began to sensual stimulate it. The apartment would soon be filled with moaning, gasps, whines, cries of ecstasy and more, all harmonizing with the now mostly ignored second event of the UA Sports Festival as it unfolded. Off to the side of the enraptured couple, on a side table long forgotten, sat a roll of yen notes, untouched. This had once been payment for services rendered, a single weekend of playing husband and wife. The money had been left there since the first day Naomasa had ever hired Yujiri, and had remained untouched for years afterward. UA Sports Festival Stadium, Contestant Arena? Victory. First place. That's what Izuku Midoriya had earned, even though it hadn't been his objective in the first event. He'd only intended to piss off the board and UA's bigoted sponsors, while showing just how capable he and his friends were. But here he was. Victorious. What an upset! What an unexpected finish! Present Mike screamed from the speakers, the blonde hero's excitement stirring the stadium crowd into hysterical applause. After being knocked out of the air by his classmate Todoroki, UA's very own necromancer managed to come from behind and steal first. Slap. The reverberating sound of something, or someone, being hit by something cut through the sound system. Present Mike cut off, suddenly yelping. He didn't steal anything, corrected the graveled voice of Eraserhead, the underground hero reprimanding, he earned it. Inside their press box, away from the prying eyes of the civilians, the two longtime friends stared each other down. Aizawa held a large paper fan, folded, resting where he'd slammed it against their booth's desk. Present Mike, arms akimbo, slowly shifted back into sitting in his chair properly, the blonde wiping away a straw bead of sweat when he realized his friend wasn't going to go any further. The voice hero huffed, crossing his arms petulantly. The way he saw it, the green bean hadn't exactly worked for his win, hadn't really suffered for it like other students of his had. He'd taken charge in the first obstacle, sure, but after that he'd literally had an easy ride over the second and third stages. But, rules were rules, and Midoriya had broken exactly none of them. Back down in the stadium's arena, said Verdinet could be found completely ignoring the Jumbotron-sized board showcasing the first event's final placements, with his face at the top. Instead, the young hero in training was watching his friends and girlfriend as they finally arrived and jogged toward him. The group of three hadn't made it in after Todoroki, third and fourth place going to the unorthodox team of Ida and Uraraka instead, but his loved ones were still all smiles. Hell yeah! Kyuka shouted, still coming down from her racing high, you did it. Fumikage followed closely behind the punk rock teen, eyes locked on one of his raised hands. It may or may not have been the same hand Kyuka had grabbed while their team had been piloting the hovercraft. Thanks to you guys. Izuku shot back, just in time to brace for impact with an adorable frog girl as she rocketed into him. Kero. Tsuyu croaked happily as her boyfriend wrapped his arms around her. A cute smile, with her tongue poking out from between her lips, spread across the amphibian teen's normally blank face. Izuku chuckled, his heart filling with love for the girl in his arms. What he wouldn't give to go back in time and tell that sad little boy he'd once been that one day he'd have someone like Tsuyu in his corner. Maybe then he wouldn't be the slowly recovering mess he was today. I just hope next time I get a little warning before being yeeted like that, Izuku joked, nodding appreciatively at Fumikage. The Verdinet frowned when he saw his avian-headed friend flinch back at the playful comment. Forgive me, Fumikage begged, head bowed toward Izuku in supplication. The normally composed teen seemed to struggle with finding the proper words. The spirit of our revelry was too passionate. I succumbed to its enticements and acted in thoughtless haste. I Apollo. Fumikage. The raven-headed teen snapped up, locking eyes with the friend whose life he might have endangered. The friend who was smiling? Don't worry about it, Izuku said, waving a hand dismissively, just warn me next time so we can do it better. Fumikage blinked in surprise, finally understanding that not only was his friend not angry with him at all, but he was also open to implementing his thoughtless act as a legitimate tactic in the future. His time to wallow in shock came to a swift end though, courtesy of a not-so-subtle elbow to the sides at the hands of a winking Kyuka. The avian teen felt his stomach flutter, and for once he didn't think it was Dark Shadow getting comfortable. Of course my friend. Fumikage eventually proclaimed once he'd gathered himself, once more serious and overly dramatic. Not for the first time he was glad no one could see his face under his feathers. It will be a true revelry of the dark. A tactical strike, from the abyss. A moment of silence passed. The four friends burst into loud, cheerful laughter, tinged with only slight hysterical disbelief. Because honestly, they couldn't believe it. They'd placed so high, higher than they'd ever thought they could or would, and there'd been no reprimands as of yet. It was only now sinking in that while their teamwork had been completely unexpected, it really hadn't broken any rules whatsoever. And here come our last few contenders. With the placement board nearly full, present Mick's slightly subdued announcement really wasn't needed, but it did succeed in drawing everyone's attention back to the final stretch of the obstacle race. The last students entered, gasping for breath and nearly stumbling as they ran. Momo Yaoyorozu, winded due to the rigors of the test, kept her fuzzing gaze down as she crossed the finish line. The class president was beyond disappointed with her performance. She was by no means a slouch or out of shape, but the Ravenette slowed to a stop, bending over and breathing deeply to avoid passing out. After using her quirk to create what amounted to a zero-pointer buster rifle and the required shells to fire with, the mature teen had refused to admit she'd gone overboard and had left herself below optimal levels. Maintaining a quirk-like creation took effort, and Momo had spent years experimenting to find the perfect ratio of muscle to fat that pushed it to its limits. Unfortunately, that had left her with a body unaccustomed to long periods of intensive exercise, like running, after heavy quirk use. Had she been less tired, or less focused on her lily deprivation, the class president of Class 1A might have remembered she had the power to create alternative modes of transportation, like a bicycle. But she wasn't, and she didn't. Yuga Aoyama, unfortunately for the poor half-Japanese half-French teen, crossed the finish line dead last, by a large margin. The blonde appeared to be sick, nearly dragging his feet as he clenched his arms tightly over his stomach. Overuse of his quirk had been his undoing, and for his troubles he suffered the mocking laughter and jeers of an uncaring audience as punishment. Izuku had to bite his lip to stop from making a scene. What right did these people have to make fun of a student giving it their all? Well, all right, everybody. Midnight's amplified voice quickly drew the attention of the stadium to the heroine, who was once again standing on her podium. Now that everyone's arrived, let's hand out some points. From the stands came a roar of approval that could be felt as a physical force, rattling ribcages and straining eardrums. On the field, the gathered students tensed in anticipation. Every year, UA changed the sports festival in many ways, both aesthetically and technically. The concept of points being awarded after an event was nothing new, but the real problem was the complete randomosity employed in regards to their use, importance, or even what decided how many a competitor started with for the next event. This year, points will be awarded on a sliding scale according to the placement of the first 42 finishers, Midnight announced with a flourish of her ever-present flog-like whip. Up above, the jumbo-sized placement board shifted every competitor's profile picture to the left, a spinning set of numbers popping into existence to their right. Starting with last place, 5 points. Aoyama whimpered from his place at the side of the gathered students as the whirling numbers next to his name went from 3 mystery digits to a dismal 005. From there, each competitor will get an additional 5 points per placement. As the R-rated heroine continued speaking, more numbers appeared on the board. Momo shook her head in shame as 010 dropped next to her name. Above her, the class president saw someone named Hitoshi Shinso get awarded 015. One by one, the competitors saw their scores. However, they knew they weren't out of the woods yet. What did these points mean in regards to the second round? When they were allowed to start? Who was more important? Odds against events? And in first place? Midnight teased, voice raised to be heard over the crazed audience even amplified as it was, is Izuku Midoriya, who's awarded 10 million points? In the absolute silence that suddenly engulfed the stadium, the Verdunette's stunned words almost echoed. Izuku failed to hear Tsuyu's reassurances, or the supportive words of his friends. His mind had kicked into high gear in an instant, before he could stop it. The world was ringing in his ears. Silent. Buzzing. Quiet. Mute but screaming. Izukun. Izuku snapped back to reality. Somehow Tsuyu had gotten in front of him, and his head was between her hands in a gentle grip. Behind him stood Fumikage and Kyuka, the two both placing a hand on his trembling shoulders. Now grounded, the Verdunette tried to shake off whatever had just happened, mind immediately compartmentalizing the experience away as it turned to cranking out possible scenarios for what was coming next. While Izuku and his group huddled together, Todoroki found himself dropping into despair. His score of 205 had turned red and was dropping, digit by digit. It was already at 197. 196. While the heterochromatic said nothing, Midnight was easily able to perceive the anger and frustration rippling through the scarred teen. 195. It was only natural, she supposed. 194. The son of Endeavor had already failed to come in first, and now he was realizing he would actually be punished for his actions. 193. By now, others who had been watching the board had begun to notice that Todoroki's score was going down. 192. The booing and cries of outrage began when it looked like the drop, while slowing, wouldn't stop anytime soon. Apparently Todoroki had quite a few fans in the audience. Or perhaps, his father did. 191. Quiet. Midnight boomed, silencing all but the most ardent hecklers in an instant. The R-rated heroine glared into the drone that had positioned itself nearest her face. It was made perfectly clear from the beginning that attacking other competitors in the first event was completely forbidden. Izuku blinked, exchanging glances with his friends and girlfriend. He honestly hadn't thought UA would carry through with that threat when it came to a student like Todoroki. How often did the connected and powerful get held to the same rules as everyone else? Midnight sneered at the drone's camera, nearly growling at the looks of malcontent she could see from the stands. We were lucky no one was seriously hurt due to Todoroki-san's actions, the 18-plus only heroine spat, glowering at any civilian who dared look her in the eye from her podium. Needless to say, any man or woman unlucky enough to make eye contact was instantly cowed. Heroes abide by the rules. Naughty little boys and girls who don't. Midnight turned to Todoroki, who'd finally turned away from the board to stare blankly at the pro-heroine. The Ravenet gave a savage grin, the heterochromatic teen gulped on instinct. Are not heroes. The pro-heroes in the audience, at least those who deserved the title, clapped, whistled, and cheered. The smarter civilians did too, the ones who'd had to deal with the ramifications of what happened when those with powers didn't care about who got hurt as long as they got their way. Seeing that she'd made her point, and anyone still upset with Todoroki's punishment wasn't going to be stupid enough to do anything about it, Midnight snapped her whip toward the board. All eyes returned to the jumbo-sized display. 180. Gasps rang out. With Izuku sitting at the top with 10 million, Ida and Uraraka sharing their score of 200, and Tsuyu, Fumikage, and Kyuka following right with 195, 190, and 185, respectively, Todoroki had fallen to 6th. The heterochromatic teen clenched his fists at the revelation of his new position. And now, on to the second event. Midnight announced, glad to finally get the show on the road. What could it possibly be? The R-rated heroine posed as the holographic roulette wheel kicked off. Watching the display closely, the Ravenet frowned. The spin dial was still moving faster than she'd ever seen it go. It was slower than it had been for the first event, but only just. Something smelled, and with a quirk like somnambulist, Midnight had learned to trust her nose. The holograph froze. And it looks like we're having a cavalry battle. Midnight declared, somewhat redundantly, as the display exploded in a rain of virtual confetti. The spin dial dissolved into a clip of All Might riding on top of the linked arms of 3 other pro-heroes. For this event, you'll form teams of 2 to 4. Izuku scoffed. Oh, now the powers that be wanted them to work together? How convenient, since they'd just been expected to race against each other like their lives depended on it. Tsuyu tugged on the Verdunet's arm, and he turned his attention back to their teacher. The rider, and the remaining will be the horses. But don't ride your teammates too hard now, the 18-plus only heroine purred, licking her lips as she eyed the students looking up at her. Many of the males shivered, though from fear or nascent desire, who could say? Because teams that fall apart will be disqualified. Same goes if the rider touches the ground for any reason. As Midnight continued explaining, Izuku felt the gazes of many of those around him turn his way. Having the highest number of points could be good or bad for him, the green-haired teen supposed. It could give his team a boost of some sort, an earlier start, or even more chances to battle or whatever. Just as long as the point of the event wasn't. The goal is to gather the points competitors won from the first round, Midnight said, waving at the jumbo-sized board above them all. Izuku swallowed thickly. Not good. Headbands marked with each team's total will be worn by the riders. Anyone can take the bands from other teams, but riders must wear their spoils as soon as possible. Show off for us, won't you? The Ravenet continued to explain the second event, but Izuku just shook his head faintly as he took the information in, a stone growing in his stomach. What the hell was the board thinking? Stealing from others to advance themselves? How the fuck was that heroic at all? That was literally the exact opposite of what heroes should do. Sure, the event would showcase teamwork, and how the hero hopefuls could synergize with quirks they may or may not be familiar with, but come on. There had to be a better way? The Verdunet turned to look at his girlfriend and steadfast friends. Tsuyu gave a resolute nod. She had his back. Fumikage crossed his arms as he gave a small grin and nod as well. Kyuka snorted, pressing a finger to her chin in mock consideration before giving a lopsided smile and a thumbs up. And so it was decided. The team would stand together. Through adversity and strife, they would remain strong. Expectations be damned. Okay then. Midnight called out, I think that's everything. Let's get those teams made, everyone. And remember, play nice. No one has to join your team if they don't want to. Go. Once they were given the go-ahead, Izuku and his group instantly moved to huddle together. Izuchi! Izuchi! Too quick for the Verdinet in question to react, a pink missile slammed into his back, wrapping around one of his arms like a koala. Do you have room for another teammate? Mei Hatsum shouted, as enthusiastic as usual. Tsuyu frowned at the sight of her boyfriend being manhandled, but kept herself from growling. Come on! Come on! Come on! Pretty please? Izuku looked down awkwardly at the pinkette wrapped around his arm, at the innocently manic grin directed at him, and truly felt bad for what he was about to do. It wasn't that he didn't like Hatsum, it was just... I'm sorry, Hatsum-san, the young hero in training apologized, scratching the back of his head hesitantly, but I already teamed up with these guys. I'm really sorry. Mei blinked rapidly, mind clearly attempting to process the gentle rejection. The crosshairs in the pinkette's golden eyes constricted and slackened, her quirk misfiring as her mind was faced with an unexpected development that, oddly, caused her chest to hurt a little. What? Mei stammered, at a sudden loss of what to do and numbly dropping from the arm she'd held captive. BBBB, but I have everything you could ever need or want right here. Hover boots, grappling hooks, shield generators, and that's not even half of it. The young inventor was not panicking. Panicking led to accidents in the lab and explosions. But as she listed every gadget and gizmo she'd managed to cram into her backpack and work belt, the pinkette couldn't help the sinking feeling in her stomach. She hadn't realized how much she'd counted on her partnership with Izuchi to pull through here. And now that it had failed her, why would anyone pay attention to her if she wasn't on the team with the most points? She wouldn't be able to catch the eye of any of the big support companies if she were on her own. Everyone would ignore her, and her babies, and then she'd have wasted a whole sports festival. And as a failure she'd have to quit the support course, and then go back home and be ignored some more, and then be alone with none of her babies, and then... A warm hand landed on Mei's shoulder, returning the pinkette to reality and halting her rambling. Looking up, the young inventor saw a somewhat blurry Izuchi looking back at her with worry in his emerald eyes. Why was the world all blurry? She had perfect vision. Was it raining all of a sudden? It's not that I don't think your babies would be helpful, Hatsum-san, Izuku said, smiling encouragingly. The Verdinet gestured around to his teammates, visage hardening with unbreakable determination. It's just that our team isn't planning on moving an inch during the second round. If you partnered with us, no one would get to see your wonderful inventions at work. Mei gave into the powerful urge to sniffle, breathing in deeply as her insides settled with the new information she'd been given. An uncharacteristically sad look warped the pinkette's face for an instant, before disappearing as a familiar manic smile returned full force. You know, you're the best client a girl could ask for, Mei said softly, almost too quiet for Izuku to hear. The rosy inventor turned to leave, looking back only once to throw a few parting words. Make sure you come by the lab after the festival, okay? I've got some awesome new ideas for your suit. Izuku waved goodbye to the pinkette as she dived back into the chattering crowd of competitors who hadn't made teams yet. A poke in the ribs made the Verdinet jerk in surprise only to find a pouting Tsuyu the culprit. So, what was that about not moving an inch? Kyuka asked, hoping to break the staring contest between the two lovebirds. The punk rocker wasn't worried about the outcome of the second event per se, she was just curious what her genius of a friend had come up with now. Pulling the curtain on all the rigged shit, or do you have a plan? Tsuyu and Fumikage glanced at the verdant cinnamon roll with matching inquisitiveness. Izuku only smiled, more innocent than ever. Obviously, we're sitting in first place, the green-haired teen began, receiving affirmative nods from his team. No doubt the bozos up top thought Todoroki-san would win no matter what. But now that the points are ours, we don't need to put ourselves in danger, or endanger anybody else. So, let's go full defensive instead. From a certain angle, the move made sense. But it wasn't the explanation the other three had been looking for. But, Fumikage chanced, cutting out the dramatic speech, wouldn't that mean moving more to avoid confrontation? Izuku shook his head, more than happy to show his friends how he planned to turn another event on its head. Fumikage, could you please call out Dark Shadow for a second? The Verdinet asked. Without any outward sign of being summoned, the eldritch quirk entity slithered out from under Fumicage's shirt. The darker-than-black tear that signified Dark Shadow's mouth ripped upward at both corners as the sentient quirk cheerfully greeted the young necromancer while wrapping around its host. Kyuka-chan, could you step closer please? Izuku then asked, quickly turning to add another request, I need to touch one of your jacks, but only if you're fine with it. The punk rocker couldn't fight the slight flush that came at her team leader's words. hoping that the others would take it as embarrassment at being asked such an intimate question in public, and not for getting so close to the boy she'd crushed on for years. The musician almost failed to hide an awkward smile. With as much care as possible, Izuku gently took one of Kyuka's jacks between two fingers. The feeling of warmth that instantly flooded the appendage nearly forced a full-on blush out of the punk rock girl. Thankfully, keeping her eyes on Fumicage's face, which was locked on her captured jack with laser-like focus, helped Kyuka overcome the girly impulses. Dark Shadow, much to the dismay of Fumicage's edgy reputation, easily accepted a head pat from his fellow Master of Darkness. The avian teen then watched as the young necromancer jabbed the held jack into his quirk's shadowy chest. The resulting squeak of surprise was too adorable to not chuckle at. As Kyuka's heartbeat was fed through her quirk and infused into the sentient quirk's body, something happened. Dark Shadow's skin began to ripple. "I feel strange," Dark Shadow reported, raising an undulating arm up for closer inspection. "It's like I can feel the sun, but not." That entirely unhelpful account only confused the trio of Fumikage, Kyuka, and Tsuyu more. "Light is composed of photons," Izuku began to explain, patting Dark Shadow again and causing the sentient quirk to ripple like living tar. "And photons vibrate at a certain frequency. If we can guess the correct antiphase frequency, Kyuka should be able to essentially shield Dark Shadow from sunlight while out in the open." Kyuka and Fumikage exchanged glances, surprised that their quirks could interact at such level. Or that Izuku could look like such a mad scientist. "It'll require a really high frequency though," Izuku confessed, brow furrowing in worry. "Do you think you can pull it off? Continuously?" The question caused the subject in question to adopt a pensive look. "That'd mean increasing my pulse to a crazy high level," Kyuka murmured, eyes darting as she thought hard on whether or not it was possible for her. "Maybe?" In an act completely out of character for the resident edgelord, Fumikage suddenly took advantage of the closeness the group's huddle afforded him and lightly poked Kyuka in the surprisingly muscular stomach. The startled yelp the dark violet let out sounded oh so delightful to the raven-headed teen. The rippling across Dark Shadow's skin intensified. "I guess I can," Kyuka replied, more concerned with not blushing than glaring at the culprit who'd made her Kia. "I know you can," Fumikage stated firmly. 10 minutes later? All teams had assembled, and team captains, those who stood out most in each group, were beginning to mount their horses. Most groups were comprised of 4 competitors, allowing the captains on top to ride 3 horses for the highest level of stability. There were teams of 3 here and there, but those only involved competitors who couldn't talk the few teams of 2 into separating and joining them. "Hagakure-san." Mizo Shuji's soothing voice called to the floating UAPE uniform resting atop his wide back. "Shouldn't we have tried to get more members?" The gentle giant was, unknown to those around him, beginning to get worried for the girl he'd partnered with. At first, everything had been fine. He'd offered her an ear or 3 to talk to, shoulders to cry on, and she'd begun to open up to him about her USJ trauma. He'd thought he was doing a good thing, helping her recover and return to the person she'd been. But lately, "But no one wanted us," Toru replied, chipper voice far from exuberant as it had been at the beginning of the semester, but not as deadened as it had been recently. "Besides, everything will be fine as long as we're together." That right there. More and more in the last couple days, Hagakure would slip little comments like that into their conversations. It was almost like she was becoming dependent on him. Mizo didn't know what to do, but if he didn't find an answer soon, the gentle giant feared his classmate would irreversibly change into something frightening. Besides, the Dupliarms user was no fool. He knew Hagakure's attempts to remain close to him couldn't be real affection. He was in any case, he hadn't done anything to earn such ardor from a girl like her. "I just don't understand it," Momo mumbled to herself as she climbed atop her horse, eyeing a team that 2 of her classmates had joined. Why would those 2 do something like that? Originally, the creation user had planned to team up with Mina and Kirishima, both to keep the 2 from doing anything foolish while unsupervised together, and as a way to ensure all 3 of them made it to the 3rd event under her leadership. But when the Ravenet had eventually found the duo, they and a beastly giant of a fellow from Class 1B had already partnered up with a purple-haired student with large bags under his eyes. And as she continued to watch, Momo couldn't help but think all 3 were acting strangely even now. "Don't worry about it," shouted the Pinkette supporting the class president from below. Mei Hatsum had come out of nowhere, that was for sure, but Momo was fairly sure the inventor was one of the best possible partners that could have found her. Now sporting 4 mechanical spider-like limbs from her combat harness, the other girl was carrying the Yayorozu heiress on her shoulders like she weighed nothing. It almost seemed unfair. Besides, Mei laughed, it's their loss for not wanting to be on the team with the sharpest minds at UA. The moment the young inventor had learned that Momo's quirk allowed her to reproduce objects and raw materials at will, she'd suggested creating additional pieces for her gear that she'd been unable to carry with her at the start of the festival. The Ravenet had been hesitant, but after some thought supposed it would be considered legal since the parts would be the result of pure quirk usage. And that's it for prep time, everyone. Midnight cheerfully announced, swinging her whip high above her head. Now let's review the RU. The 18+ only heroine's words trailed off, as she and practically every spectator of the sports festival froze in stupefied shock. They really couldn't help but stare at. This isn't how I wanted to stand out. From atop her 3 horses, Kyukajiro sat embarrassed beyond all belief, arms flailing and face beet red. The musician had rebelliously tied the team's headband of ludicrous points around her neck like a loose scarf, the red numbers painting a bloodthirsty grin across her throat. Why isn't Izuku up here? Kyuka shouted again, asking the question everyone watching wanted to know. He's the captain. Why isn't he the rider? The punk rock girl had a point. Every other team had put their highest profile member as their rider. Todoroki sat over a team of Ida, Ochako, and a determined Ojiro. Momo was perched on Mei's shoulders while the Pinkette was supported by her equipment. Itsuka of Class 1B was being carried by the vines of Shiozaki and protected by the living shield that was Tetsu. Everyone had expected the monster of UA to claim a spot at the top. Why wouldn't such a notorious figure seat himself high for all the world to see? But he hadn't. Midoriya stood proudly as a horse, and not even the front horse of his team either. Standing side by side with his girlfriend Tsuyu, the green duo took a rear guard behind the party's advanced defender Tokoyami. I'm actually heavier than I look, Izuku murmured to his team so only they would hear. Also, this will make it easier for you to make your connection. The Verdinet wasn't wrong. Or lying. Since the start of Cursed Blood's progression, he'd gained weight due to a subtle increase in the density of his bones and muscle mass. The fact that his actions once again upended tradition and stuck it to the board and UA's sponsors was just a sweet bonus. Besides, Izuku continued, patting the thigh of the musician that rested on his shoulder, the public will love looking at you more than me. Kyuka blushed even harder, almost steaming. Tsuchan! Kyuka cried, desperate for some support from her female friend, are you just going to let him flirt with me like that? Tsuyu raised a finger to her lips in thought, her amphibious tongue poking out just a bit. A small grin bloomed through the frog girl's normally impassive face. Well, Tsuyu said, looking back at the distressed musician, you are pretty cute, Karo. Kyuka flailed again, bopping Fumicage's head a number of times to get the avian teen's attention and support. The punk rocker had never expected to ever receive compliments for her looks, especially not from her former crush, or said former crush's girlfriend. Fumicage, somehow, managed to turn his head around enough to make eye contact with the dark violet. I beseech thee, dark maiden, the raven-headed teen spoke in an uncharacteristically suave voice, entreat me not to gaze upon you now. Your beauty wouldst surely blind mine eyes, and presently we must focus. Kyuka stuttered and stammered, unable to speak, and red as a tomato. Hearing such charged words, Midnight snapped out of her daze and managed to regain her composure. Like I was saying, the R-rated heroines announced, her honeyed tone enough to regain the audience's attention, the rules are as I stated earlier. With a few additions of course. The gathered students looked at the salacious Ravenet in expectant fear. Oh how she loved the looks on their faces. Each team is gunning for the headbands of the other teams, Midnight said, explaining everything plainly so no one could miss how this event was meant to showcase teamwork. Losing your headband does not disqualify you. Teams can keep fighting until time is up if they want to. The only way to be knocked out is if your team comes apart or the rider hits the ground. While previously the 18+ only heroine had smiled through her announcement, now the seductive grin fell, leaving the woman normally the wet dream of every teenage male, and some females, in Japan looking quite menacing. And while quirk use is free reign during the battle, the edge alone in Midnight's voice could cut glass and freeze blood. The intentional tripping or harming of other teams and competitors is strictly forbidden. Crossing the line this time will carry far more intense consequences than lost points or disqualification. Trust me. Glaring down at the flinching and shaking students, some even shifting their pants uncomfortably, gave the R-rated heroine an inappropriate shiver down her spine. She'd been serious just then, but it was nice to know she could still affect the youth like that. She still had it. Switching to a more cheerful disposition, Midnight twirled around and snapped her whip down. And now, let the cavalry battle begin. The moment those words shot into the air, it became painfully clear what the general mentality of almost every team was. Quickly! Todoroki shouted, ordering his team forward, we have to get to Midoriya first. Initially confused, since Jiro was the rider with the 10 million headband, Ida and the others quickly understood what their captain meant and moved to attack their verdant classmates' team. At least, they hoped they understood what the heterochromatic had meant. Surely they wouldn't be commanded to aim for someone who didn't have a target on their head? Todoroki's team wasn't the only one gunning for the 10 million, however. It seemed like almost every other paired-up group of competitors was rushing toward the only guaranteed pass into the third event. Surely someone would be able to make off with the prize of prizes? Especially since Jiro's team hadn't moved a single step. Izuku took in the avalanche of students headed for his team, a small disappointed grin on his freckled face as he watched the greed flicker through their eyes. It was a pity all this effort would be for naught. Even at this distance, the predatory gleam from Todoroki's mismatched glare was unmistakable. He'd noticed it while celebrating with his friends and girlfriend after the first event. Todoroki had appeared tense, angry with some unidentifiable figure. It had only gotten worse after losing his points so publicly. And even after such humiliation, the heterochromatic hadn't asked or looked for any support, bottling up his emotions instead. To Izuku, whose mind had been turning over scenario after scenario from the moment they'd been told to make teams, there was only ever one eventual outcome. The son of Endeavor was about to do something drastically stupid. Sure enough, Todoroki's right arm began to frost over as his team closed in. Kyuka, Fumikage, Izuku called out calmly, making sure to appear confident as his friends turned to lock eyes with him. Now, the freckled genius was willing to gamble. It wasn't like the end result of this competition mattered to him anymore anyway, though he would feel bad for the others not being able to show their abilities to the pros. But if his plan worked. Dark shadow seethed out of Fumikage's stomach and reared up, towering over the team of 4 like a giant, obsidian sentinel. Kyuka's jacks flew up and plugged into the eldritch quirk entity's mass of darkness, the musician's already accelerated heartbeat causing high-frequency ripples immediately. The ripples quickened, faster and faster until Dark Shadow no longer felt the burning itch of light on its skin. Before it could get used to the not feeling, an overflowing well inside of the quirk being suddenly shot to the surface. "I am vengeance," the shadow beast proclaimed, raising its arms high into the air toward an enemy that could no longer touch it. "I am the night. I am the Dark Shadow." And the quirk entity exploded into a roiling shroud of darkness. At that exact moment, Todoroki made his move. Forcing his quirk through his now bare foot, freezing Ochako along the way, the heterochromatic pushed hard and formed a dome of ice. As the creation closed up above them, the mismatched team glared ferociously as he and the Emerald Necromancer were trapped inside. Together. Then Todoroki saw the dome of darkness where his target should have been. Team Todoroki hit the brakes. Ah! CCCCOLD. CCC cold. The sudden shriek from Uraraka snapped Todoroki's focus back to his team. Only then did the heterochromatic see that his move had iced over the brunette's entire torso and left side. "Todoroki-san." Ida boomed, voice overly loud in the enclosed space the team of 4 found themselves in. "How could you be so reckless? You almost froze your own teammate with that attack. Uraraka-san, are you alright? Guys? What the hell is that?" Ojiro, far from being concerned with what was going on with his classmates, was instead fixated on the black dome writhing before his eyes. As if the nightmarish image couldn't get any worse, a massive pair of burning yellow eyes opened across the front of the shadowy hemisphere. "Is that Tokoyami?" the tailed teen asked in disbelief. "SS since when W was DDD dark SH shadow that PP powerful?" Uraraka asked, still shivering from the frost coating her. The brunette didn't like the looks of the dome. It didn't look like something they should mess with. He must have been hiding his true strength this entire time. Ojiro guessed angrily. "Don't stop." Todoroki suddenly commanded, deciding that nothing would stop him, unexpected or not. "I need that headband." There was a moment of dead silence as 3 pairs of eyes turned to look up at the team captain with what could only be described as a prelude to mutiny. "Oh yeah. What a turn of events." Present Mix enhanced voice boomed through the stadium, penetrating through even the dome of ice Todoroki had created. Looking around, the team of 4 realized they could see drones flying around inside their icy prison. The game was still on, and they were being watched by teachers and the public alike. While no one can fault having such initiative, charging headlong into an unknown situation without regard to the strengths or abilities of the targets present was a horrendously irrational oversight. At least one of the students inside that dome is known for their tremendous tactical mind, and no one took that into consideration. Eraserhead's commentary was enough to sober the heterochromatic teen, while his team on the other hand only looked more upset. "Who would have thought we'd see a dome within a dome within a slap? Don't you dare." As the 2 longtime friends and pro-heroes continued their color commentary and narrated the events going on outside the ice dome, Todoroki tried to think of a solution to the predicament he now found himself in. If only he'd taken Kaminari instead of a guy with a useless tail. All he needed to do was pierce that shadow once and he could freeze everything inside of it. If only he'd been fast enough to grab the blonde before someone else had snatched him. Todoroki's eyes widened as an idea sparked across his roiling thoughts. Ida, push your engine to full power. The mismatched teen shouted, pointing ahead as if to lead the charge. The flames you exhaust will weaken their defenses. Then I'll take them out. Below the heterochromatic second guesses were exchanged. For Tenya Ida, he knew more about what was being asked of him than his captain did, and frankly, the apathetic way he and his fellow team members were being led rankled him. Recipro burst took everything he had, and afterwards he'd be useless until his stalled engines cooled down. They'd be stuck, and Todoroki didn't seem capable of understanding that even if they managed to break through Dark Shadow, they'd still have to face off against the entirety of Jiro's team at less than full strength. Achiko Uraraka was beyond upset. She'd teamed up with Tenya, of course, and the two had thought they'd hit the jackpot when the bespectacled teen had talked Todoroki into taking them on in a both-or-neither deal. But then their dual-colored classmate had seemed to become obsessed with attacking Midoriya, and while the brunette might have had her own issues with the green-haired teen, she didn't ever want to hurt him. And then Todoroki had almost frozen her. Who did that to their own teammate? Ojiro was pissed. He somehow managed to get on board with the heaviest hitter his class had, and yet he still found himself in a shitty situation. If he'd known Todoroki was dead set on taking the necromancer down, he'd have left him to it and found another team. Even as late as it had been, the tailed teen was sure he could have found at least one other team that would have liked a third member. At this rate, we won't have enough time if that doesn't work, Ojiro blurted out. Realizing he was right, the tailed teen pushed on before anyone could interrupt him. The better option is to leave them alone and go after other teams while we can. There was a moment of silence. I agree with you, Ojiro-san, Ida said after thinking the words over. We don't know what else they have ready behind Dark Shadow. And as Aizawa-sensei just said, charging in blindly is the height of irrationality. I vote F for the WW warm sunlight, Uraraka said, raising a shivering arm in agreement. White-hot anger. That was all Todoroki could feel at that moment. He needed to beat Midoriya, and right as victory was at his fingertips, he was facing a mutiny. What was this, the Pequod? What are you doing? Todoroki spat, glaring down at his horses. They weren't going to get in his way, not when he was so close. Ida. Engines. Now. As long as he didn't touch the ground, and his horses stayed together, nothing in the rules said that a team had to be mobile. Right? So he'd just freeze everyone after they broke through Midoriya's defenses. He could apologize later. Before Todoroki could think more on his new plan, he felt himself grow weightless. Looking down, the heterochromatic saw that Uraraka had touched the entire team, stealing their gravity away. In the next breath, Ida had powered up his engines. For a brief moment, the mismatched teen thought his horses had had a change of heart. They'd seen he was right and were going to charge Midoriya and his team like he'd planned. And then Ida turned and raced the team toward the closest wall of his ice dome without a second to spare. Kicking into third gear, the speedster lunged forward with a powerful kick. At the last possible second, Uraraka released her quirk on her mad captain and the bespectacled teen now leading her team. The return of their weight gave Ida enough power to crash through the ice dome without any problems. As the light of the sun hit him, Todoroki felt himself slip into complete and utter shock. They'd ignored him. They'd followed their own plan. They'd mutinied against him. The world faded into a blurry fuzz of dim noise and blobs of fast-moving color. Time lost all meaning to the mismatched teen. He didn't notice as his gravity disappeared again. He didn't notice as he was thrown back and forth as Ida sped the team here and there in a race against time. He didn't notice as headband after headband was tossed over his head. None of it penetrated the fog that had settled over Todoroki like a miasma. And then it was over. Buiuurur. The buzzer signaling the end of the cavalry battle rang out. From the darkness inside himself, Todoroki floated back into consciousness enough to realize the cold, hard truth. He'd failed again. His wall had become a mountain. And no one was going to help him tear it down. As quickly as possible, the team below the mismatched teen disbanded, heading away from the captain they'd turned against double time. At the other end of the stadium arena, Dark Shadow uncoiled and shrunk, revealing Jiro's team smiling and waving to a discontented audience upset their main attraction had hidden itself away. In contrast, Izuku and his friends felt like celebrating. They were completely rested and unfazed after what could have been a trying and tiring event. And it's over, folks. Midnight exclaimed, earning only half-hearted cheers from the upset audience. Let's take a look at the final scores. Who's moving on to round 3? Who came out on top of the competition? The already upset civilians in the stands groaned at more of the R-rated heroine's innuendo. Even so, they all looked up as the jumbo-sized scoreboard morphed to show which teams placed where. The monster of UA's team had remained in first place, of course, having hidden behind an impenetrable defense only exacerbated by the son of Endeavor's ill-advised defensive trap. After apparently giving up on achieving first place, the son of the number 2 heroes team had burst from their icy dome and worked like mad to take every headband they could. They'd kept second place by a comfortable margin. The crowd's mood started to brighten as they saw that the young Yayorozu heiress had managed to claim third place. At least someone was keeping with the way things were supposed to be. A pedigree like hers almost assured such a performance from the raven-haired girl, although not many could remember watching the girl enough to see how she'd done it. The fact that both events so far had been dominated by the antithesis of their ideals overshadowed much of the audience's praise. Something in the air just felt sinister. Remote monitoring room C, oversight of scores and student performance? Sir, as much as I agree with you, I can't do that. The current security advisor of UA, Haruno, spoke into her cell phone with hushed tones and worried glances. This was the last thing the middle-aged woman wanted to be doing right now, but it wasn't her choice to make, was it? Yes sir, I understand, the Pinkette said, probably for the 10th time by now. You put a lot of money into making this festival possible. It's only reasonable that the competitor you've taken a shine to gets an opportunity to shine. While those plebeians down below were surprised by the unexpected series of events unfolding today, certain people of import were becoming furious. Behind closed doors, away from prying and furry ears, threats had been made and words had been spoken. It boiled down to one simple fact. Even though it was tradition that the first-year champion be a temporary poster boy for UA's top sponsors, tradition or not, no mutant freak or dark radical would ever be allowed to be the banner carrier for these support companies. Don't worry madam, Haruno replied to another caller also on the line, confidence bleeding through her worry, only the best will shine in the third event. I guarantee you'll see only the most promising future heroes at the top. Once the line was cut, the Pinkette sighed a weary breath of relief. I hope that promise of yours only meant what it should, Haruno-san? Aya. UA's security advisor screamed like a little girl at the unexpected question, and the unwelcome presence it came from. For once, Principal Nizu didn't look or sound like a cute and amicable little dog rat bear thing. In fact, the quirked animal looked positively feral with barely contained rage. Oh, of course. Haruno choked out through her fear. I was just reassuring a few of our worried sponsors. They were concerned that the tournament wouldn't bring out the best in our students the way things were going. Suddenly, the Pinkette felt an unholy level of dread grip her soul in a vice. The middle-aged woman couldn't move, could hardly breath. What was going on? Oh? Shivers ran down the security advisor's spine at the new, feminine voice, a voice that whispered right next to her ear. You do know that being caught tampering with an event like UA's sports festival would result in far worse than being pinned for losing a sponsor or two, right? Haruno swallowed, tried to swallow. She couldn't get her body to listen to her. It felt like every muscle she had was locked tighter than a virgin's chastity belt. Who are you? Haruno stuttered out, abruptly aware she needed to keep her quivering bladder in check. The sultry chuckle that answered did nothing to alleviate any of the Pinkette's soul-breaking dread. Trust me honey, you don't want to know, the unknown woman whispering into Haruno's ear said as she stepped forward and went to sit in one of the various chairs littering the small room, black suit pristine. The terrifying stranger calmly held up a steaming mug of coffee and took a sip. But you will soon, if you're planning on doing what I know you are. Haruno tried to focus on the woman sitting before her, but for some reason her eyes just wouldn't remain still. Every time the Pinkette's jade-green eyes landed on the interloper they'd slide off of their own accord. It was maddening, and only added to her terror. A moment of silence passed. The security advisor, feeling control of her limbs suddenly returned to her, fled the room as fast as she could. Oh no. Stop, the suited woman drawled, not at all concerned that her prey had run. Nizu glanced at the spook beside him in puzzlement. Run as fast as you want, you won't be able to stop him. You'll only make things so much worse. Back in the stadium? After midnight had cleared out the disqualified students from the arena, those left had mingled in high spirits. One particular green-haired necromancer felt as if he'd already won the whole festival. I never thought we'd make it this far, Izuku murmured, earning chuckles from those close to him, like the old-time heroes used to say, right? United we can do anything. From beside the Verdunette, Fumikage clapped a hand on his shoulder, a slight grin on his beak. Together with our sunlit stars, we'll proclaim the power of darkness for all to see. The avian teen declared loudly, returning to his theatrics. 'Tis their folly for considering our combined might so easily overcome. Usually not one to openly begin conflict, Fumikage couldn't help but direct that last bit solely at a fuming Todoroki, who seemed a hair's breadth from marching over to Izuku. As the group of friends laughed, an unexpected someone hesitantly walked up to them unseen. Or, more specifically, walked up to Izuku in particular. Chattering amongst themselves, Izuku and his friends had no chance of hearing the gently murmured sound. Midori. The speaker, a tiny brunette whose eyes were covered by her overly long bangs, held herself behind the fringe of the group of 1A students, too shy to articulate a single word and too small to be seen. Realizing she was going to miss her chance if she didn't go beyond, the diminutive girl suddenly clenched her fists as determination flooded her petite frame. She'd waited nearly a decade for this. Izukun. Izuku and his friends froze, falling silent at the unexpected shout. The young hero in question glanced at his girlfriend, confirming she hadn't been the one to use his pet name. Turning toward the source of the cry, he nearly stumbled back as a brown, elfin-sized missile came barreling at him, stopping just short of tackling him. What could Izuku say? He didn't even know how to describe this development. I know you may not remember me. But. For a split second, Kanoko Komori felt the unpleasant urge to run away and hide, but with untapped inner steel the brunette managed to stomp the cowardly feeling down. She really needed to do this. A long time ago, I let my fear keep me from talking to you. I was a coward because, after he, what they, and then, even when. Kanoko felt the familiar sting in her eyes as she felt closer and closer to losing the battle against her tears. She began to curl inward, bowing her head in shame. She'd wanted to be strong, but the trauma of that painful day in kindergarten had once again risen up to pull her down. First losing the first boy who'd ever thought her quirk wasn't creepy, who'd been friendly to her, and then years of berating herself for letting others decide who she could be friends with, it was too much. Her therapy hadn't helped at all. She was still the weak little fungus girl, just like that blonde had said. The tears threatened to fall, and Kanoko knew she was about to break out into full-on bawling any second. I do. Kanoko gasped, shocked out of her downward spiral by two simple words. Snapping her head up, the brunette's unique brown eyes locked on to the gentle gaze of Izuku Midoriya. I may not have ever known your name, the kind Verdunette continued, but I remember you. It really is a shame we couldn't have been friends back then, but I wasn't nearly strong enough to protect you. Tears of a different sort spilled openly down the mushroom girl's cheeks. A watery smile began to grow as a warm feeling ignited in her chest. I know what it's like to keep everything bottled up, Izuku asserted, nodding self-deprecatingly. It's harder than anyone can know. And I didn't help things at all back when we first met again weeks ago? I'm sorry I didn't recognize you until recently. Izuku scratched the back of his head, ashamed to know that he'd only connected the dots of who Komori was after he'd already pulled the trigger while looking at her through the scope of a sniper rifle. The young hero in training tenderly raised a hand to the now shaking brunette standing before him. But, if you're willing, I'd like to try and be friends again. The Verdunette had recognized something in those russet eyes, as he'd stared into them through the scope's lens, a hunger he knew all too well. The girl he could just barely remember from all those years ago held a burning need for true friendship, even as she was paradoxically too scared to let someone in to resonate with her heart. It was a desire and fear knotted into one agonizing mishmash of emotional turmoil. Like he'd said, he'd been there before, for quite some time. Oh yes? Kanoko shouted, eyes glistening with happiness and joy and deeply buried fears laid to rest. I would. Then the mushroom girl darted forward and glomped her new friend. Wrapping around him like a koala bear, the brunette gave him a merry kiss on the cheek before darting away and running off. Rico! Izuku and his friends could hear faintly as Kanoko passed into a tunnel gateway up to the 1B stands. I did it. And he said yes. Brain abruptly short-circuited, Izuku could only lightly touch his recently assaulted cheek. On one hand, the Verdunette was happy that he'd finally been able to recover a long-lost friend. On the other? Tsuchan. Already feeling a penetrating stare digging into his back, and completely unsure of what to say, Izuku swallowed as he turned to face the music, and ended up staring into the serious eyes of Kyukajiro. Since it looks like today is Thank Izuku Day, the musician said, grabbing Izuku by the collar and hauling him close. When there were only a few inches between the two's faces, the punk rock girl leaned forward and pecked the Verdunette's other cheek. That's for saving some random girl you didn't even know from being stabbed years ago. Izuku pulled back, eyes blowing wide in shock. That was you? The flabbergasted young hero in training asked, unable to even stutter. I know I should have said something sooner but, you know. Kyuka stepped back, rubbing one arm bashfully. I guess even I get girly nerves sometimes. With her piece said, the Violet turned and faced the raven-headed teen beside her, gaze expectant. For his part, Fumikage didn't look bothered by what had just happened in the least. There, Kyuka drawled, arms crossing, we can be a thing now, officially. Just, don't expect me to be some frilly princess, alright? Fumikage shrugged, still unflappable. Why wouldst I seek a princess when you, a queen, hast deigned to allow me your presence? While Kyuka dealt with all the blood that was rushing to her face at her now boyfriend's words, it finally registered to Izuku that he'd just been kissed not once, but twice. Nervous, the Verdunette turned to see how Tsuyu had taken the events that had just unfolded. Even if he'd done nothing himself, the young necromancer expected at least a slap and maybe a dressing down. Instead, Izuku felt a pair of larger-than-normal hands gently caress his cheeks. For the most heroic boyfriend in the world, Tsuyu said, right before she pulled said boyfriend down and initiated a sloppy French hiss. It wasn't that the frog girl wasn't jealous, it'd be a lie if Tsuyu said she hadn't felt a burning in her gut when she'd seen her Aizu be kissed by someone other than her, but when it came down to it, she knew her boyfriend needed confirmation that his actions were heroic and deserving of praise, not yelling and blame-laying. The collective sound of hundreds if not thousands of catcalls, whistles, and people gushing at the open display of affection belatedly registered with the frog girl, and she hastily broke the kiss as she only then remembered that they weren't just in a full sports stadium, but also being televised for the entire nation, and much of the world, to see. Oh boy. Tsuchan. Izuku breathed, overwhelmed by the love he'd felt his girlfriend pushing into him from that kiss. Marry me. The reverberating echo of his declaration, amplified by every single speaker in the stadium, snapped Izuku back to reality. Looking down, the Verdunette saw a microphone under his chin. Following the hand holding the device to its owner, the grinning face of Midnight met his panicked gaze. The R-rated heroine gave a thumbs up as she sashayed away, doing nothing for her now positively mortified student, who was now glowing red. The audience meanwhile exploded into cheers, roaring in agreement with the daring words spoken by the teenage hero wannabe who was, right now, at the top of the first-year tournament. Needless to say, two mothers were currently doing a celebratory dance at the shorter one's home, much to the puzzlement of a pair of tadpoles. Redacted, bar. That was certainly, daring, the deep voice of Kurogyri echoed in the mostly empty bar, speaking to no one in particular. The Dark Mist villain recognized the special type of bravery it took for anyone to utter such words. Seeing a proposal like that niggled at something in the back of Barkeep's mind. It also explains why the twerp risked so much to save the little froggy back then. Shigaraki muttered sourly, recalling what had happened back at the USJ. The green brat had blasted him with a goddamn shotgun. And now he knew it hadn't been some foolish act of heroic valor. It had been personal. I guess we'll just have to include the little tadpole in our plans now, Shigaraki rasped, a wide psychotic grin stretching his dry face. Knowing that the tools to destroy the world of heroes were now laid out before him had the young villain almost euphoric. But, he knew he had to be patient. Rushing now would only get him in trouble. In more ways than one. But now things were fun again. What had once been a broken action-adventure game had suddenly gotten new DLC and become an old-school RPG. And if there was one thing Tamura Shigaraki knew, it was how to beat an RPG. All he'd have to do is plan carefully. He was playing on Iron Man mode, after all. The white-haired 20-year-old was so involved in his own thoughts that he didn't even notice as his babysitter froze and tensed up, a wispy hand flying to his head. Completely ignored, Kurogyri fumbled with a pocket on his vest until he was able to pull out an old battered pill bottle. With shaking hands, the villain of Dark Mists and Portals downed a single pitch-black pill from the bottle. Pocketing the medicine, Kurogyri returned to his bar and grabbed a glass to clean. And while he twirled the cleaning rag around and around, the echoing shouts and sounds of falling rock faded from his mind. Omake, woes of a gentle giant. How did it end up like this? Mizo Shuji thought to himself as he watched his friend in slight concern. So, which one do you think makes me look better? Asked Toru Hagakure as the invisible girl held up two dresses. One was frilly with a flower print on it while the other was checkered with red and white boxes. Mizo did his best not to sigh. While the combined human and animal extremities on his tentacles did give him the ability to see his friend after a fashion, he hadn't known admitting to such would get him sucked into hours of shopping. The giant tried not to complain however. This might have been the first time Hagakure had ever had someone who'd actually seen her help her buy clothes. Checkered suits you better, Mizo answered calmly and measured, basing his answer on simple knowledge of color and shape composition rather than any vaunted fashion sense. What? He'd said he understood where his friend was coming from, not that he understood shopping. At least enjoying painting had turned out to help him in certainly unforeseeable ways. Now if only I could understand why she seeks my opinion so ardently, the gentle giant thought, his mind returning to the circle it had spiraled for hours now. It's not like I'm her boyfriend. Do friends really take each other's words so seriously? As always, Mizo could only conclude that all of this had come about because he could see his friend. That fact naturally had led to the belief that Hagakure must have felt less lonely with him by her side. It was a key part of the reason he hadn't pushed her away. Although, the invisible girl hadn't exactly been pushy or demanding so far, outings such as this would only happen if he freely admitted that he was available and willing. Really? Toru asked in something that might have been surprise. Shifting her weight to one side, it was obvious that the transparent girl had grown pensive, visible or not. Okay then. Just let me try it on first. You know, in case the measurements are wrong. Mizo merely nodded at the words. They were sensible and they hadn't been at this particular store too long. Honestly, the gentle giant was grateful that shopping with Toru wasn't the dreaded nightmarish marathon he'd overheard other boys describe. But this wasn't a date. They were not dating. So of course it was different. Mizo-kun, since we're here, was there anything you wanted to check out? Toru asked from behind the changing curtain. The invisible girl's words were calm and honestly inquisitive, nothing like the accelerated and energetic flurry she used when with Ishido. Now that you mention it, I may have to get a new calligraphy brush, Mizo agreed, feeling odd at being shown such consideration. Hopefully I'll be able to find an inkwell too. I guess I'll just have to learn to accept that I have a female friend. Now, Mizo wasn't sure how he felt about that thought, only that he felt a sort of warmth from knowing for the first time someone had actually remembered and asked after one of his hobbies. It's too bad she's invisible to everyone else. She's kind of cute like this. Being around the transparent girl so much recently had given the gentle giant an unexpected revelation. Toru oftentimes pushed herself to act a certain way to be noticed or accepted. That wasn't to say she faked her personality. Mizo had been smart enough to see that his friend wasn't that kind of person at least. It was just that, on the first day of the semester, seeing how popular Ishido had made her Hagakure's goal to match. A visible mirror, as it were, to copy so others would pay attention to her instead of forget she was there. And for the most part it had worked. The invisible girl had made friends with most of her classmates within a day. But around him, Mizo knew that his friend could be more of herself, feel free to openly disagree with him, and pursue similar interests without coming off in a bad way. Hagakure still liked to laugh, but understood that he liked his quiet too. Likewise, while he enjoyed his studies and spending time indoors, he knew that the invisible girl loved walking under the stars and the breeze in her face. The changing booth opened. To the world, a floating dress stepped out and hovered toward the gentle giant, hips swinging just a tad more than normal. Does it look good? Toru asked, giving a slow spin to show off all her angles. I mean, I don't feel like it's too tight, but I also don't want it to look loose, you know? Mizo didn't know, but he looked at his friend anyway. Up, down, left, right. The gentle giant couldn't find any problems with the dress. Looks good, Mizo replied, short but well-intentioned. By how Hagakure clapped, the invisible girl had read him right once again. Thanks. Toru's natural cheerfulness shone through as her voice pitched up. But then the invisible girl began to fidget, the fluttery sleeves of the dress dropping down loosely. There's just one last little thing I need your help with. Don't worry, you can check it out right now, no need to wait. Mizo chuckled, he'd heard that before. All right, what is it? A bystander might have thought the gentle giant had finally reached his last nerve, but he knew Hagakure knew better. Accordingly, the invisible girl proceeded to show him what she wanted to. Here, Toru said, lifting up the front of her dress. In front of Mizo. In clear view of the rest of them all. What do you think? Toru asked in a completely innocent tone. Not using panties looks a lot less perverted than if I wore them, right? Mizo didn't say a word, his natural eyes staring down at the space under the raised fabric. I mean, no one can see anything, Toru added, swaying her hips. If I wore panties, or even bloomers, well, some lucky perv might be able to see the shape of my, you know, if there was an accident. Apparently satisfied with her own reasoning, and lack of reaction from her companion, Toru dropped the edges of her dress she'd been holding and went back behind the changing booth's curtain. Alone again, Mizo raised a tentacle and wiped the bead of blood that had almost dripped out of the nose he'd grown there. The gentle giant finally admitted it to himself. He needed help. But who in his class had enough experience with girls to even provide that kind of assistance? More importantly, should he tell Hagakure that he'd had his special sight activated this entire time? And that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed. Support the writer. Don't forget to like, sub and share.